or their skin color or the bumps on their head or the simple-minded things we use to stereotype and categorize people.
Anything but this.
Yeah, anything but this. This is.
Yeah, but Donald, depending which part of modernism you're talking about, because the 19th century, that's exactly what they did. So you're going back all the way back, or you like early modern, or
this.
It's like there's so many simple but wrong answers about why people do what they do.
Well, okay, humans were reclassified as the fourth ape. The advice is keep away from them, don't feed them, watch out they bite.
Right. But I think to the point of Section E, you won't know in advance which ones will bite and which ones won't. Even the ones who say, I absolutely won't bite you, some of them will bite you. And some of the ones who say, I will absolutely bite you, would never bite you. It's like, how can it be this confusing? Well, let's talk about daimons.
Yeah, this throws a real monkey wrench into know thyself. It almost indicates that one can't, or it's difficult.
Yeah, let me put the intro stuff here.
Yeah, but Donald, if you're going to follow Stephen with that thing about the fourth ape, you shouldn't say monkey wrench. You should say ape wrench.
Oh.
I've been getting a bit more and more impressed by Nietzsche's Madman. And his claim that nihilism will take over gradually. We're even today, we're still coasting with the religious values of the past.
Yes.
And bit by bit, humanity will discover that these don't apply because we're not following the same tradition anymore. The basis of our moral values, for example, Nietzsche would say, have been burned away. We just haven't noticed. But more and more gradually, the populace will notice that those old moral values don't mean terribly much anymore. And it won't be in our age. He said, maybe the 22nd century will be it. But there's one hell of a party coming along for which World War II or World War I, the Nazis or the Marxists were just the entrees.
Yeah, the general issue being that, the Achilles heel of modernity is something modernity raises us not to be able to perceive. And so even when there's striking object lessons in front of us that we could look at and go, wow, that's us, we instead go, oh, no, that's not us, that's them. They're an aberration. They're, that Hitler, he was a crazy guy. So that's why he did that. What we can't accept is that the most modern country did that, and that there's something about modernity and the way that we're all raised that predisposes us, as Hannah Arendt warns us, to adapt to things that we should never adapt to, to become a cog in the machine.
Well, I raised that point with a guy who was claiming to be an existentialist, and gradually during the meeting, I noticed he was a Hegelian.
Hey,
I was saying, he's Nietzsche's Madman, you're doomed by nihilism. He's going all over the place. No, there's ideals against this. We've got all the magic potions and the formulas and right. Okay. I hear this all the time.
Okay, Rick, if you're going to bring in, like the blame game, didn't that start out in the Garden of Eden? I mean, like when God said, you ate from the tree of knowledge, and of course, immediately Adam says, well, she gave it to me. And of course,
right.
And Eve said, no, it's the damn snake. I mean, the blame game just sort of start. I mean, that is part of it, is the blame game.
And the next step is the snake saying, but God made me this way. It's pretty soon it comes all the way back to the judger being the judged, right?
This is where Plotinus becomes interesting, because he had some very interesting angles
Yes.
that were essentially not part of the Christian package on all this.
Yes.
The idea of the fall, the idea of repeated earth lives. He said these were the first two evils. Then he referred to a third level of evil, which I don't thoroughly understand, which is punished by the daemons alone.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to spending some time with Plotinus. I'm right now I'm deeply ignorant. But we've come to section E, daimon and eudaimonia of chapter 4. Ancient civ, not ancient div. Ancient civilizations is chapter 4 of the book Millennia and Microcosm, which is our subject. This is Kenneth Smith. This is a part of a long-running series of seminars we do on Mondays at this time on philosopher Kenneth Smith and his works. For the past year, we have been going through his book, which started out as a column in the Comics Journal of all things around the years 98, 99, 2000. It's been collected into a book called Millennia and Microcosm. We're going through chapter 4, Ancient Civilization. What he's trying to do in this book, he's postulating that each major epoch of history has a pattern of worldviews that it encourages in the people raised in that epoch. This is all Hegelian, Kierkegaardian, Nietzschean, Arendtian kind of existentialist ideas, and that people raised in that epoch think that they're seeing the world the way it really is, but instead they're seeing the world in ways that are stereotypical of the era that they belong to. They just don't know it. They can't tell. They can't see the fingerprints of their era smearing their glasses and preventing them from being able to see the world the way that it is. And they take those fingerprints for granted as being part of the way reality is. They don't understand that people haven't always seen with those particular warps and distortions, and that in other periods of time, people had different warps and distortions that were characteristic of their time. Kenneth Smith says part of becoming a philosopher is learning to extricate yourself from 100% commitment to and assumption of the objectivity of your worldview, and coming to be able to pick it up and take it off and set it aside and put on a different worldview, like to look at the world in a medieval way, or to look at the world in an ancient way, or some other radically different worldview, because only then can you compare and contrast the distortions that the different worldviews are imposing. You can say, when I look at this as a modern, it looks one way, but if I look at it as an ancient, it's surprising what has changed, what's completely different. So what he's trying to do in chapter 4, this is a book with many chapters, but he's of the 3 epochs he's going to cover, ancient, medieval, and modern. Chapter 4, he's trying to cover an entire epoch in one chapter. And he's doing that because he taught this class a lot on the ancient philosophy and ancient civilization. So he's got it down. This one is really tuned up. The later chapters, he needs more chapters to talk about the other epochs. So right now, in chapter 4 is broken up into 8 lettered sections. We've gone through A, B, C, and D so far. It's, if you follow the link, I need to put another link up there. You need the link to the End Times 4. That is Millennia and Microcosm chapter 4. There it is. There's the link. So if you go there, you can navigate to this. That's chapter 4. You can navigate to section E, and you'll see the text that we're going through. We're just starting section E, which is exciting. This is his section. It builds on sections A, B, C, and D. And he's now pulling together an argument about what is human nature from the perspective of the ancients, not from our perspective or a medieval perspective. He's not talking about what's true, because we're mortals, we don't get to dictate to reality what's true. He's talking about from the ancient perspective, what would they think that human nature is? And this section is titled Daimon and Eudaimonia. And as I alluded to at the end of last session, it could also have had suffixed onto it and dysdaimonia. He's going to talk about all 3 of these terms: daimon, eudaimonia, dysdaimonia. So we're going to dive into this in a sec. But first, Phil has his hand up. We haven't even opened our very first sentence yet. And here comes Phil. Go ahead, man.
Well, it was based on what you said about, like you live in an era in which you can't even see because you're structured within the ontology of the era. And it seems to me that really brings to mind something that I'm concerned with as an artist is the nature of the visible and the invisible. And the thing about the invisible is that it first appears the invisible is just very far away. That's why it's invisible. But as it turns out, the deeper part of philosophy is seeing the invisible that's right in front of you, right there with you. Whether that means your culture or whether that means your own inner psyche. I mean, all these things are the deeper part of the invisible because you just assume that that is part of the ontology. I mean, that's a part of everything and it's like nothing, but the nothing is sort of like the appearance of nothing is actually something. I think that might be the basis of the development, even the early development of dialectic, right? Being is, like, well, what the hell is, it's like, so I think that's actually a deep idea is like, how do you see the invisible? And I was struck by what Stephen said about the three levels. At the third level, he didn't quite understand. And there's a movie, it's a it's not that recent, fairly recent movie, Tombstone. And I was struck, there was this guy, part of the OK Corral. He was a kind of a bad guy. Like, he seemed to hate everybody. And finally, there was a fight between Doc Holliday, who fought in the place of Wyatt Earp because he knew that Wyatt Earp couldn't draw as quickly as he did. So he went and did it. And so when Wyatt Earp finally came and he said, "Oh, I thought you were sick." He said, "Well, I was a sort of hypocrite," and he gave him back the badge, but I can't go that far. And so they discussed this guy like about how he's angry at everybody. And Wyatt Earp is like, who is he angry at? Because he seemed to be angry. And Doc Holliday says, he's angry. And this goes back to what I said to Donald. He's angry that he was ever born. And so he had to take it out on everybody who was alive, right? So that is very interesting. I mean, there really is that part that's deep in his psyche that the anger was in a way invisible. It was part of him. So yes, by all means, dig into the invisible, because the invisible is all around you. It is you, actually. That's the biggest part. So I think that's important what you said. That's why I want to interrupt.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Phil. Thank you for bringing that up. It's core to what we're about to get into here. That the ancient perspective is a philosophical perspective. Philosophy arose out of the ancient Greek mystery religions. At least ancient Greek philosophy did. Heraclitus, we've mentioned before. This section, by the way, the word daimon appearing in the title means this is Heraclitus. This is all about Heraclitus. You learn how Kenneth Smith writes and thinks. You learn what his influences are, and you eventually learn there are certain keywords and phrases that he draws intact from other philosophers. And every time he uses that word, he means it in the way they meant it. He's different from a lot of modern systematizing philosophers in that he's not trying to point to himself. He's trying to point away from himself to all the other people we should be reading. There isn't time for him to relentlessly in every sentence over and over list all of the influences. So what he does instead is he uses these keywords in certain ways. So Heraclitus is the philosopher of archai, of the principles of nature and how they combine in dialectical forms that are complex, so that things both exist and also change at the same time, so that we both understand and misunderstand the world and so forth. So, the invisible is a relentless topic in Heraclitus. Like Phil's alluding to here, you want to talk about human character, we have the same problem that we have when we try to talk about breathing. What are we inhaling? Well, it's invisible. We can't see. What is the difference between air that's poisonous and air that's nutritious for us, that's got a healthy balance of oxygen? Well, it isn't in something that you can see, and that's the problem. And so Heraclitus who is a philosopher of science by his own testimony. He believes that we should take a scientific approach to human character the same way that we do to studying natural phenomena. Here is a fragment from Heraclitus that I'm gonna bring up here because it's relevant to what Phil said and to this entire essay. It comes from this. You can pick up this copy of this book, a 1959 translation of Heraclitus by philosopher Philip Wheelwright. It's available for free at the Internet Archive. You can download the PDF, and I encourage you to. It's Kenneth Smith's favorite translation of Heraclitus, and when he's making references to Heraclitus, like he does in section E here very strongly, you know, it's this translation more than any other translation that he has in his mind. So, you know, what Heraclitus is talking about here is this idea that nature is governed by an invisible set of principles and laws, which he calls the logos. And he doesn't mean the Christian logos, and he doesn't mean the Parmenidean logos. He's definitely talking about something different, an idea that there is a character to nature, that there's certain things it will tend to do and things it will not tend to do. And that character is not written out in the open. All we can see are the fingerprints of nature's actions, the consequences. But if we try to directly imbue those fingerprints with meaning, we'll misunderstand the world. We have to look below, beneath, behind, before the evidence in front of us to figure out, well, where did that come from? Why is it the way it is? And as we work that out, we start to understand the character of nature. We start to be able to make inferences about, you know, what is this logos that is the intelligence of nature, you know, the way that nature acts and doesn't act. So here, the subject of the invisible, it's critical, right? His very first fragment, he talks about the logos all the damn time, right? Heraclitus is mentioning the logos left, right, and center. And every time he does, he's talking about the invisible, you know, the role of the things we can't see in shaping the things that we do see. Here he talks about the problem of epistemology primarily. Every time, you know, up until 2 years ago, every time I read this fragment, which was many, many times, I always thought about it in terms of what do we know and what do we not know. But there's a critical element, I think it was about 2 years ago that I brought up in one of these seminars that I've never noticed before, which is in the very final phrasing, where he says, other men, on the contrary, are as forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep. Now, anybody who's seen Heraclitus's other quotes about sleepwalkers and people not being conscious, but actually being, you know, interacting with the world through their ideology instead of the way that the world really is, and therefore they're like sleepwalkers, the main thing that strikes you is this reference to sleep, right? Forgetful, heedless, asleep seems to be the emphasis. But it was about 2 years ago that I realized that my focus on that meant that I was overlooking something right in front of me here, which is what is going on around and within them, around and within them, right? The start of this sentence is, my own method is to distinguish each thing according to its nature and to specify how it behaves. Nature, as Kenneth Smith talked about in section A, nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth, which is where we started chapter 4 some months ago. You know, nature is a pregnant word in Greek. It's just loaded with meaning. It's the word phusis, which means becoming. In ancient Greek, you can't say nature without simultaneously saying that nothing just is, everything is becoming from what it was in the past to what it's going to be in the future, that everything grows from seeds, and that everything that is also the seed of its future self, pregnant with future mutations and developments that we can't see yet. All of this is tied up in the concept of nature. To an ancient Greek, it's just, I mean, you wouldn't think of nature any other way because it's built right into the definition of the word. So when he says nature in the first half of the sentence, this is, you know, it should come with flashing lights and sirens, and, you know, there should be big arrows pointing to it going, the subject of this sentence is nature. So when he says what is going on around and within them, he's talking about the nature around them that you can look at and hear and touch and smell and so on. But he's also talking about the nature within them that you can't see, that you can't smell or hear or touch, but that is every bit as lawful and binding upon who they are as a person as gravity or electricity or a waterfall or a rock is on what's happening around us, outside of us. That is, he's creating this dualism, this dialectic about human nature, in which he's saying the challenge for Homo sapiens is that on the one hand, we are physically constrained by what's going on around us, and that all made us possible, the nature around us. But we are behaviorally constrained by the nature within us. Our own character decides what we're going to notice or not notice. It's going to decide what we love or hate. It's going to drive through what it makes visible and what it makes invisible. It's going to drive our behavior and understanding of the world. And therefore, for people in particular, because so much of our life is the life of the mind, the nature within us, the invisible nature, is every bit as important as the nature around us. This is what he's setting up here as the core dialectic. So Phil's reference to invisibility, you can see why I'm excited, right? This is what he's saying, he's saying, fully half the picture of understanding people deals with the invisible. And it's easy for people to become too literal minded and assume that only the things they can directly see and touch and smell are the things that matter. But elsewhere, he makes perfectly clear that even those things arise from deeper principles of nature. That is, the visible parts of the nature around us arise from the invisible parts of the nature around us. There's invisible sides on both sides. Now, if you really get comfortable with this, you can see foreshadowing of Freud's theory of the unconscious, right? If there is a mirroring, if there's a metaphor, if there's a comparison going back and forth between the nature out here and the nature in here, and if out here, Heraclitus is saying over and over and over, the things we see are just the tip of the iceberg. There's all the stuff we don't see. There's what happened before. There's what's going to happen but hasn't happened yet. And there's what's happening right now, but it's too small or too big or too subtle for us to have organs to directly detect. Right? Until you touch the electric wire, you don't know that it's electric, but it was all the same. There's all this important stuff happening that we don't directly perceive. So since he's setting this up as a parallel, it means the same is true for us, right? The mistake that we make is to assume that the part of ourselves that we know is the only part that's real. But the reason why it says Gnothi Seauton, right, on the Oracle of Delphi, is because the parts we can't see generate the parts we can see. The thoughts that we're aware that we're thinking are being generated by thoughts that we aren't aware that we're thinking. Old memories, old feelings, right? Everything Freud had to say about the unconscious, everything that's happened since then in the field of psychology, exploring the vast realm of the iceberg that's below the surface of the water in human beings, this is all implied as well in what Heraclitus says explicitly about what's outside. So in section E, we're going to go back to Heraclitus over and over and over and over again. And the reasons will become clear, but I wanted to start with this fragment to tie in what Phil was saying. So thanks, Phil, for that. Stephen, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just in reference to Plotinus again, I've been intrigued by the idea of the fall, but it doesn't seem to be a purely Christian idea. We have the idea in the pagan mythology, the Greeks, there was a golden age we lost. That's in many other cultures. Even the Norse seem to have had some sort of a fall when Loki mates with the witch and produces all the evils which fall into the world. But Plotinus's point is he claims that we, in a sense, sinned and fell into the material world. And that was the punishment for our sin. But living in the material world, we committed other sins that were purely related to that state of being, a bit like the murder of Abel or something like that. And he claimed that that leads to repeated earth lives. So, it's the great samsara, the great trial of repeated earth lives. Then he talks about a third sin, which I don't fully understand, which is punished by the daemons alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading Plotinus. So for the moment, are connect the dots. And you just mentioned daimon, so it's right on the money here. It's in the title. If philosopher Kenneth Smith mentions a daimon, he is drawing it from here. He can't not be referencing this. For those who are new to this session, to the seminar, we've talked in the past that one part of the way that philosopher Kenneth Smith writes is when he thinks about a subject he wants to write about, he starts by going around and making a list of all the other philosophers, artists, writers, and so on, who he really respects their take on that subject. And he'll go dig through them and pull out what he calls choice or choice, really choice fragments and quotations that are just pregnant with meaning. And then he'll make a list of them. He makes a document. Sometimes he throws it away. Sometimes he keeps it. I have a few of them around. He'll make a little document that just lists these names of these writers and philosophers, and then they'll have a list of quotations. He loves lists of quotations, and he'll start with that and he'll look at them and he'll ruminate on it and think about it before he starts to write. And so this is why I can assure you, you can trust that if he uses the word daimon, he's referencing ethos anthropoi daimon from Heraclitus. This is one of the pivotal locations that he draws from when he's talking about the concept of daimon. Now, this quote is typically translated as character is fate. This is how it's normally translated. And there is a certain validity to that. There is a certain extent to which character is fate is a fair translation of ethos anthropoi daimon, but it's not a literal translation. And when you explore the difference between the metaphorical translation and the literal one is when you get all the power that he's developing here in section E. So the word daimon is right there, but neither the word character nor the word is nor the word fate means daimon doesn't mean any of those things. So this is a way in which the metaphorical translation that we know that we learn in pop culture isn't getting us to the root of the ancient perspective. It's just giving us a paraphrase that we might have some chance of approaching as moderns without having to dig down into the ancient worldview. But in section E, by titling it daimon and eudaimonia, he's announced his intentions, Kenneth has, to dig into this and to explore the difference between the literal translation, the modern metaphorical translation, and what is that realm of meaning that we lose when we switch to the paraphrase. In that meaning, he develops an entire section here about the nature of human character. So Philip Wheelwright translates it as a man's character is his guardian divinity. Guardian divinity is how he translates daimon. Man is translated anthropoi, and the way to read that here is not gendered, right? It's not andros. He's not referring to a male human being. He's referring to Homo sapiens. That's why it's anthropos. This is English. It's unfortunate that English has lost one of its critical nouns. What is the general term for people? But Greek still has it, and so this distinction is important. And then character is how Wheelwright is translating ethos. And ethos is a tough word to translate. You can hear in it the reference to a comparison to ethics, right? The word ethics is derived indirectly from the word ethos. And ethics and character are related, but not exactly the same thing. And the Greeks actually have the word character, and Heraclitus didn't use it here. And what he's doing instead by picking the word ethos is Heraclitus is picking a word that equivocates, Phil, equivocates between several different meanings. This equivocation is one of Phil's favorite topics. It's exploring the realm between right and wrong and ethics on the one hand, and between character and nature on the other. Ethos inhabits that whole area of meaning. It's a broad term whose meaning might have felt, to an English speaker, it feels broad. To an ancient Greek, it meant something very specific, but our language takes what for them is a unified concept and breaks it up into a bunch of different words and ideas. And for us, it feels broad to put all those things together, but that's what he's doing here. Now, what you'll find, what we're gonna find as we explore section E is that in these three words, Heraclitus has said so much that it would take multiple books in English to unpack the complete meaning of it. And I'm not talking about squeezing meaning in that wasn't there. I mean meaning that was obvious to an ancient Greek. An ancient Greek would read these three words and go, oh, yeah, okay, man. Yeah, this was like, boom, right? But we read it and we're like, how much could that possibly mean? It can't mean that much. And we're going to discover that the modern perspective is really lacking here. An enormous amount of the weight is being carried in ethos. An enormous amount of word is being carried in anthropoi, which can be used to refer to an individual person or to mankind, and therefore also to anything in between, right? A household, a neighborhood, a family, a tribe, a clan, a polis. And, you know, the polis as an organizational unit of human beings was very important to Heraclitus. He has a lot of quotes about it. So he means it simultaneously on multiple levels. Now we might say, oh, come on, you know, now it starts to sound like I'm trying to squeeze meaning in there. But the thing to understand is that Heraclitus was from the generation before Socrates. He's not writing the way Plato would, where he's trying to unpack all of his meaning for us and give it to us in some sort of accessible form, right? Plato did his dialogue specifically to give us the time to walk through the ideas and see how they interact with each other. But that earlier pre-Socratic generation, they loved doing the opposite thing. Thales, Parmenides and others, what they love to do is say the shortest possible thing that they could say and pack it with as much meaning as possible. And they used to carve these things, you know, on stones and set them up in important places. So Gnothi Seauton, the one that we've all heard, know thyself, that we've all heard the story that it's set up on the you know, entryway to the oracle at Delphi, was on a stone pillar. And it was one of many, many things carved on that pillar. And they were all, because it's stone and people have to carve this thing, they wanted it to be short, right? The whole goal was to make a kind of philosophical poetry that crammed as much meaning into as small a space as possible. They were like deliberately doing that. Nothing to excess, right? Agon Mede, I forget the order of the words on this one. Nothing to excess, which is another classical ancient Greek wisdom, piece of wisdom that Aristotle basically built an entire philosophy and, you know, multiple books out of, comes out of these two words, right? That again, that was the point. Get it short, make it something you could carve on stone that could act as a mnemonic for this entire body of insights to be anchored with these just a handful of words. These stones were so important to ancient Greek culture, even later, even in Plato's generation, even in Aristotle's, even in Alexander the Great's, that wherever Alexander took his armies when they were spreading across the world conquering, they would have stone carvers carve this exact same list of precepts into these stone pillars and set them up in the places they went. There's one in India, for example. Even though he didn't go very far into India, they spent long enough there to set one up. It was incredibly important to them conceptually that what they were doing was trying to spread wisdom and also trying to collect wisdom wherever they went. So what I'm trying to say is these three words that I'm going to spend, you know, probably months unpacking as we go through section E in the weeks and months ahead. We're not distorting it by doing this. These were incredibly important to the ancient Greeks. They're meant to be unpacked. Aristotle, in reviewing Heraclitus's scroll at the great temple of Artemis in Ephesus, his advice to readers is turn the scroll slowly, because every new fragment you see, you have to stop and go back over all the fragments you read before. They're meant to be combined. They're meant to impact each other. They're meant to change each other. There's supposed to be all this meaning to this, and that he was writing in that form. So we're going to unpack this, but I'm going to go ahead and pause here so that people can jump in. I'll call on Phil in a second, but Geneva hasn't talked yet today. So go ahead, Geneva, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, I have a question about what you just posted about the character is fate and what Heraclitus says, a man's character is his guardian divinity. So is he saying that character is already preformed? That doesn't seem like that leaves room for development or evolution, or I just wanted a little clarification.
You
It's a
got it.
pedestrian question, but yeah.
It's not pedestrian at all. It's one of the most important questions about this. I'm so glad you brought it up. Yeah. So character as fate is an English approximation, but as you point out, it loses something in translation. And among the things it loses is the English word fate means the ending is already written, right? And therefore, it seems to suggest that we don't have any free will, that our fate is predetermined, and therefore, why bother, right? Why bother doing anything if nothing really matters? And that's not what the original means. The word fate doesn't appear anywhere in the original in Greek. Ethos anthropoi daimon. It's what we're going to unpack here is this idea about what is a daimon and what is their relationship to a human being. And in that, what we're going to discover, part of the reason why this unpacks into so many interesting ideas, is the ancient Greek take on free will and determinism is so much more interesting than the modern take. The modern take is it must be one or the other. And the ancient take is, well, it depends. It depends on your character. And since you can cultivate your own character, it depends on the extent to which you've invested the time in changing your character to give yourself a better character that could create a better outcome. So there's a feedback loop built into the ancient conception that's totally missing from modern discussions of free will versus determinism.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
It's a very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for asking the question, Geneva. Stephen poses a great question, but I'm going to come back to that. Phil, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have so many things to say. But there's plenty of time to say it in one sense. What I want to do is connect what I sort of wanted to say before you respond to my whatever my talk, and then how that connects to Diamond. It seems to me it's sort of partly pre-born, but it's the internalization of the whole, in some sense. You could say internalization of the exterior, but I had this sort of funny, you could say, what is it? Ethics, ethos. Ethos is the internalization of that, and in a funny way, at least in my life, in my understanding, aesthetics is not exactly that, but is adjacent to it. So there's a relationship between those two. I mean, what is ethos or ethics in Diamond is it's also what is beautiful in relationship to Diamond in the deep sense. And so once you've internalized it, then it becomes interesting because, like, one of the things about this, the invisible, is that it's hard to see, at least the external part, because it's like looking at magic. You don't know the secret of the magic, even though they're synthetic. All you could surmise is to see all the relationship, the visible, and therefore, in a sense, draw a relationship between them and have a feeling for, oh, what must be invisible behind that. And yesterday, I was in a seminar in the Hegel group, but it was about Marcuse's discussion of the dialectic. Very, very interesting. And we got to Hegel. And the week before, we were talking about what came before Hegel. And Fichte, Johann Fichte, who, by the way, Hegel occupied Fichte's seat after Fichte died, which is very, very interesting. And so many people, at least early in life, thought he was, the inheritor of Fichtean thinking, because Fichte was very, very prominent at that time, along with Schiller. And I think Fichte says something interesting, and now Fichte is not very well remember, and we were discussing about the relationship between Fichte and Kant and Hegel, and there was the discussion that Fichte now is pretty much kind of forgotten because the relationship between Kant and Hegel, and the criticism that Hegel had with Kant was that his thinking was one-dimensional. In other words, dealing with the visible. I mean, in this case, the visible of the mind, of logic, okay, a reductive way of thinking. And what he did was, and Kant was aware there was this other thing that's sort of like, well, I'll put it aside, that's just too complicated to deal with it. And he picked it up. And I kind of defended Fichte. I shouldn't have defended him because I don't know enough about him. I was so impressed by what little I read from Marcuse that I said, well, this is interesting. Because what Fichte was in the tradition of German idealism, and he said, what happened in the development of dialectic, and so that was that, in a sense, mind began to understand that what it tried to understand the world, it meets up with resistance. And I remember reading that. I said, oh, this really sounds like Camus' Sisyphus thing, right? The struggle. How do you get around this? Because this thing is almost immovable. And he said, and I defended him and said, this is kind of an important moment because mind has discovered the otherness in dialectic, the other idea, okay? Even though it has not been externalized to the other world, the idealism was important because the otherness, which is part of the self, by the way, begins to open the dimension that there is a push-pull between the relationship. And what Hegel did in some sense in the transition between Kant, Fichte, and Hegel is that he externalized this into nature. And so Fichte was the missing link in a way that's been forgotten because we said, oh no, that was all in Kant anyway, and Hegel took up the missing part and explored it. And I said, no, even though that's true, Fichte was a bridging character that opened up the concept of otherness. And otherness is a very important part of the dialectic because in order to understand your internal self, your diamond, you have to understand otherness. What is not you? What is not? Okay. And so in some sense, I think that was an important part is to, in a sense, in order to understand yourself, you have to understand otherness. I say otherness in a broader sense than others. I mean, others is related to other human beings. And without that understanding, then in a sense, you stand as a singularity in which you could only sort of like become like Hamlet. You do the soliloquy, talking to yourself, right? And so I think that's important to understand that the internalization of ethics and aesthetics and all that is that you have this relationship with otherness. And understanding otherness is difficult because you have to understand the ego in order to emulate this relationship that's in nature or the world. Maybe I shouldn't say nature, the world. Has to understand the ego has to emulate this dimension of the push-pull within the context of nature as well. And so therefore, in some sense, it's very, very important. And I think those who are driven by too much ego are locked in internal thing that it can't get out of. So that's why I want to say, and I think that's where that's what the development of the diamond is. Even though you're born with natural ability, you have to develop within it the understanding that there is a other part of your ego that's other than yourself. And once you understand that, you unfold that into the otherness in the world. So I thought I'd add that part since you talked about the diamond.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate it. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff here to unpack as we go. So everything that you just said is of course right on topic here. Ethos anthropoi daimon. So let's go to the text, and we'll just keep hopping back and forth between Heraclitus and Kenneth Smith. And I'm going to try to show you where he's drawing from as he says these things, what his influences are, and therefore kind of what his meaning is. So he opens up section E, daimon and eudaimonia, by trying to start defining what a daimon is. He says, what instincts are to animals, daimones are to human beings. Right? We did this opening sentence at the end of last session, but we've got some new people today, and it's in fact, half of us are new this week, which is cool. And it's worth going back to the foundations of this to make sure that we don't modernize our reading of this sentence. So he's established in the earlier sections that, nature is seen as this realm of becoming. The ancient Greek word for nature is phusis. Phusis means becoming. Things are constantly changing. But that nature for the ancients was also a realm of intrinsic truth. That to the Greeks, kata phusei, I'm going to put that phrase in there for you guys, kata phusei equals according to nature. According to nature, kata phusei was the ultimate proof. It trumped logic. It transcended mathematics, logic, rationality, reason. If something was actually so, if you actually could perceive it in nature, then it's like that meme from 10 years ago, talk to the hands, or here's a duckling riding a bicycle, your argument is irrelevant. It's the moment that whatever fabulous argument you might have to prove or disprove something, nature would always win. If there was an example that clearly illustrated that your argument was off. And in this, there is an echo of Kafka's in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world. One of Kenneth Smith's favorite quotes. This is alluding to this idea that nature is intrinsically true. Nature doesn't need us to say what it means, and it doesn't need the gods to say what it means. It doesn't need anything to give it meaning. It is a fountain of meaning. It is full of information and meaning if we can but exert ourselves to learn from it. That's the ancient perspective. It's very different from the medieval perspective. It's very different from the modern perspective. But that's all caught up in this idea. We start talking about instincts. We talk about animals. We're talking about the ancient perspective on the rest of the animal kingdom, right? This is so by comparison, he's trying to tell us something about human nature by starting with everybody else's nature. And he's saying, they have these instincts to frame them in to behave in healthy ways. And these instincts have evolved over millions of years. The ancients weren't sure how old the world was, but Heraclitus thought that it was eternal and had always been around. So the idea of a depth of time rather than a modern creation is certainly compatible with the ancient worldview. And it is their instincts that make animals frame in their behavior in ways that are sustainable for them, that are healthy for them. The issue of what is healthy and what is not healthy is a major concern of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greek philosophers, Aristotle writes about it a lot. What is the good? By which he doesn't mean what is the unhealthy good. He means the good that is healthy, the healthy that is good. What should we be striving for, because it brings us to our best form, our arete, as the previous section was titled, right? And animals have instincts to develop their aretes. They don't need to go to school. Their instincts will make them engage in the behaviors that will exercise the parts of themselves they need to get good at. Cheetah cubs pretty quickly want to start running, and you don't have to drag them against their will to run. Once they start, tumbling into running, you can hardly stop them. And I got kittens a couple of months ago. They're upstairs and they're in their base camp. We're going to bring them out this week to meet the rest of the house. And I don't have to teach them to run and jump and pounce. I can hardly stop them from running and jumping and pouncing. They get so excited. They'll go after my hair. They'll go after my hand. They'll try to jump up Beverly's skirt. I mean, you know, they're like, anything is a toy and it's all meant to be pounced upon. Nobody told them this. This is their instincts. And because they see the world that way, it draws them into the behaviors that make them good at running and jumping and pouncing. So the question he's posing in the opening sentence here, so what is it in human beings that draw us into doing what's healthy for us? Because anybody who observes human beings across cultures will come to the same conclusion, which is that whatever our repertoire of instincts might be, it is not nearly as tight a frame as it is for other animals. Human beings can organize their cultures around the craziest of ideas and make it work, right? There's not a tight frame that says all people are going to behave the same way everywhere on Earth. And instead, we seem to have a very, very wide frame. And now partly that's filled in by culture. We talked about that in an earlier section. We talked about the role of culture in Homo sapiens in completing us, you know, filling in the gaps where our instincts are supposed to be, or where the missing instincts are. We have some instincts, but the missing ones largely get filled in by our culture. But what is the nature of that filling in? How does it work? Other than just waving our arm and making a metaphor. And what he's saying is, it is our character, specifically our daimones, that are within us playing the role of instincts. Now that, if we've read the previous sections, if we read it in a flow from A, B, C, D to here, we'll understand that he's implying, therefore, that culture plays a role in daimones, right? Our daimones are acculturated, because he already said culture plays this role with instincts. Now he's saying daimones play this role with human beings of filling in the missing instincts. So daimones are the mechanism by which culture does this. But first he's going to turn to what are daimones. The lowest order of gods, now this is the ancient perspective, right? The lowest order of gods is the obscure soul companions who are the source of our impulses to see or want things as we do. So let's break this down, the lowest order of gods. Now in the ancient perspective, there is a hierarchy of meaning in the world. And at the very top is not the gods. That's a medieval idea. At the very top is nature. Nature is the source of all meaning in the ancient worldview. Below nature are the gods. You have a polytheistic religion in which the purpose of the divinities is to translate the confusing, complicated, subtle aspects of nature that nevertheless are incredibly important for us to pay attention to into some simple anthropomorphized figure who we can name and remember stories about. And from those, you know, even a child could learn some wisdom about the dangers of war, or, you know, pay attention. If you start to be heavily attracted to something, it can draw you off of your reason and off of your plans. And, you know, all of these things are divinities because they have authority over us. That's the ancient perspective. The list of divinities in an ancient pantheon is not we worship them or they punish us. There's not the kind of golden calf dynamic that you see in the, you know, in the Old Testament. There is instead this idea of a what Nietzsche calls an avuncular relationship to the deities. Rather than paternal, thou shalt. In fact, Nietzsche says, no Greek god ever told a Greek thou shalt. And that's his attempt to summarize one of the ways in which the ancient relationship to their gods is totally different from the medieval relationship or the modern relationship. To them, the deities were aspects of nature personified and made memorable so we wouldn't forget about them. And their purpose is to remind us, don't forget, when you get into your boat and go out onto the ocean, don't forget about Poseidon, right? The ocean might give you wealth, but it also is full of monsters. Poseidon, the father of monsters, right? So, you know, it's dangerous. You have to be careful. Poseidon is there to act as a caution. If you, as a modern person, if you were raised in a culture of hiking and camping, your parents teach you about the things to watch out for. If it's cold, watch out for getting wet. Watch out for hypothermia. If there's a river, watch out for currents, right? If there's a bear, back off, right? You learn these things so that even a kid who has very little experience with the world can learn some basic behavior that will keep them out of trouble. To the ancients, this was the role of the gods, that they are serving as touch points for memorable myths and stories to help keep us out of trouble. So if he says these are the lowest order of gods, first of all, he's saying that to the ancients, they're gods. Daimones are gods, which means they have authority over us. In the ancient hierarchy of meaning, it's nature, then the gods, and then man at the bottom, right? There's a three-part set of relationships you can use to typify the ancient world, the medieval world, and the modern world. And in the ancient world, this was the order. Nature is preeminent, then the gods, who, by the way, come and go. They have generations. There were the Titans before there were the Olympians. And even in the classical Greek myths, the Greek gods knew that eventually they would be succeeded by a new generation of gods. They talk about it in some of the myths, right? So this idea that they're not as eternal as nature was just built right into the mythology. And then below that is Homo sapiens. People are subject not only to the gods, but to nature, right? And therefore, we have all the responsibility to learn about nature, to learn about the gods, and thereby try not to, step off a cliff, stick our finger into a beehive, all those other things that if you're an infant, it's just natural. Why shouldn't I do this thing? Well, then let me tell you a story about Zeus, right? And the lightning bolts. Don't stand under the tree during a lightning storm. Oh, okay, I got it. This I can remember. So they're saying that daimones are part of that level of meaning and authority, that daimones have authority over people, that when push comes to shove, if we act in ways that are out of sync with daimones, we lose. Just like if we try to act out of sync with gravity, we lose. If you want to fly in an airplane, you can't just ignore gravity. You have to harness other natural forces to counterbalance gravity, or you aren't going anywhere. Gravity will always win, right? We only fly with the cooperation of gravity. And it's the same with these divinities in the ancient perspective. Now, what's interesting about daimones, as he's going to say in the next sentence, is that where Ares or Poseidon or Artemis is a divinity for everybody, daimones are personal. Each person gets one daimon. That's like your guardian angel from a Christian perspective, except they wouldn't use the words guardian angel in an ancient perspective. They see the world differently. Your daimon is not there to keep you out of trouble. Your daimon is there to nudge you one way or another. And if you've got a good daimon, it will nudge you to keep you out of trouble and lead you towards nourishing things. But if you've got a bad daimon, it will nudge you towards all the worst things, all the wrong things. The quality of your daimon directly affects the quality of your life, because what makes sense to you is determined by your daimon. This is the relationship he's trying to describe. And this is a metaphor for character, right? What is that nature within you? What is the pattern of natural behaviors within you? What is the source? What is the fountain of order within you that generates your personality and your behavior? They're saying, well, it's your character, and the way to understand your character is as a daimon. It's like a personality of its own, separate from you. And it doesn't tell you what to do, as he's going to say. It nudges you so that some things make sense and seem reasonable to you, or seem interesting to you and draw you out of yourself. And other things don't make sense and don't seem interesting, and they might just vanish out of your awareness completely. And that foreground background game of which parts of nature's infinite and our mind is finite. So you can't fit the infinite in the finite. So how much of this is going to vanish away into the background and become blurry and not interesting? And which things are going to stand out as, oh, that's interesting, I should pay attention to that. We take that for granted, but it's one of the most important functions of the mind. And it totally determines our relationship to the truth, even though we don't think about it. And he's going to tell you here that the ancients believe the daimon is doing that for you. Before you ever get to think, before you ever get to engage in logic or reason or science, before you ever can consciously engage with deciding how the world looks to you, your daimon has already erased almost all of reality and picked out a few things that these are the things that you're going to find interesting, whether they're good or bad or what have you, right? The human mind can only consciously keep track of 7 ± 2 things at a time. Well, what happened to the infinite other things? Even looking into my backyard, look at all those leaves, look at all those plants. There's a roof line there. There's a tree in the distance. Which of these things am I going to pay attention to? And he said, well, my daimon is going to pick that for me before I ever start to think my first thought. I'm going to look out there, and it's almost all going to feel like background. And then my brain is going to go to the hummingbird that's hovering next to the blossoms on my rosemary. Why? Why that? Why didn't I look at that, 760th yellow leaf over there on the yellow twig dogwood? And the answer is because of my character. My daimon picked for me, right? It's like all those elections. There might be 350 million people in the United States, but you aren't going to get to vote for most of them. You're only going to get to pick off the list that's been presented to you. Who made that decision that this is your list? Well, when it comes to you interacting with the world, your daimon made that decision. And the reason they characterize it as an order of gods is because the structure of human intelligence is so vulnerable to this foreground background activity, right? If something isn't interesting to you, you literally can't think about it. It's like we're helpless. It's only the things that are interesting to us that we can make conscious decisions about. The things that never get into our awareness, right? We're completely passive about. There's no opportunity. Right now, in Beijing, on a certain corner, somebody's doing something. It could be something that's really important, but I'm not there and I can't see it. I literally can't change my behavior right now based on what that person is doing on that street corner right now. They're out of my awareness. Like almost all of the cosmos is out of my awareness. This is what there's this issue of pathos, right? The parts of life and nature we have to suffer versus praxis, the parts of life or nature that we can act on, that we can choose on, that we can be willful about. The parts that we can choose or be willful about are only the parts that came to our attention. All the rest of the cosmos, we're like a stone being acted upon, but not acting. So we don't know what's happening on Jupiter. We don't know what's happening in Alpha Centauri. Almost everything in the cosmos is outside of our consciousness and therefore outside of our realm of acting according to. So this is why they're saying it's a god. The part of your consciousness that picks what's interesting and how you feel about it has so much authority over your life. It's every bit as much as Poseidon having authority over the ocean. The oceans have authority over sailors. Ares has authority over soldiers, and likewise, your daimon has authority over you, your mind, your behavior, and your character, because it determines what you're even aware of. That's a divine function, translating the infinite of nature into the finite of a human mind. That act of translation is what the layer of the ancient gods was for, to perform that translation. To say, of the many, many things that you are, because you're mortal, going to ignore because your mind is finite, here are the things you really shouldn't ignore. You really, really should never forget about this list of things. That's your pantheon, right? And they add the daimon to it. Now, it calls it the low. Why does he say the lowest order of gods? He says it's the lowest order of gods because the other gods, are gods for everybody, right? Ares is Ares for everyone. But your daimon is only your daimon for you. Your character only controls your behavior, your awareness, your perception, not anybody else. That's as small a zone as you can have and still be infinite in the way that the gods are infinite. So a personal god is the lowest order of god because we're down to a single person being affected. So this is what he's talking about in this opening. So he says the lowest order of gods is the obscure soul companions, right? For every person, there's a daimon in the ancient perspective, who are the source of our impulses to see or to want things as we do. What are we able to be aware of? And of the things that we're aware of, how are we able to feel about them? What do we want or not want? Well, that happens subconsciously. None of it's rational. It all happens, to use the Hegelian, Kenneth Smithian terms, it all happens at the level of gnosis and noesis, right? Gnosis is the level of the experience of life. And it's the faculty that the modern world undervalues, which is ironic because it does almost all of the work. Gnosis is the level at which your daimon acts. And most things fade into the background so that there's a small selection of interesting things that your conscious mind can think about and make choices about. Go ahead, Geneva, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So I'm wondering about the diamond being the lesser god, like to Zeus and Jupiter or whatever, and all of the others. So are they like in cahoots with each other? Like the lesser god gets information from the bigger gods, or are they disconnected at all? Or does Kenneth Smith address that? Because I'm trying to, I guess, come to terms with this two sets of gods.
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
It's a great question. Yeah, I wasn't thinking about talking about that today, but we should. We should talk about it right now.
I'm sorry.
We should talk about it right now. No, I'm glad you
Okay.
brought it up. So,
Okay.
part of I think it was a year and a half ago that we first talked, when we were talking about mythos and logos, that we first talked about the difference between monotheism and polytheism when it comes to philosophy. Why were the ancients polytheistic? And part of the reason for this is that it comes down to Heraclitus and his observation that nature never just is, but it's always becoming through processes of struggle, the dialectic. That, the metaphor we've used before in the past is, why does your blood pressure stay in a healthy zone? Well, there's parts of your body that are good at raising your blood pressure, and there's parts of your body that are good at lowering your blood pressure. But what you don't have is any part of your body that's good at putting your blood pressure exactly where it's supposed to be. That's not how it works. Biologically, the two systems are harnessed together. And if you get too far one way, then the other system pulls back harder. And if it pulls back too hard, and now your blood pressure is too high, then the part that's responsible for lowering your blood pressure pulls back harder. So these two, and you can see if I had refreshed my understanding for today's seminar, I could actually name the things involved. I could name some of the systems involved. You've got smooth muscles that wrap all of your veins and arteries, and those smooth muscles can constrict or dilate your blood vessels. And if they dilate your blood vessels, it increases the volume of your blood system and therefore lowers the pressure. If it constricts, it pulls down tighter, then the same amount of liquid is being squeezed into a smaller space, and it raises your blood pressure, right? And then you've got your spleen. Part of the function of, we talk about the immune function of the spleen because we're obsessed with the immune system, but a major function of the spleen is it's also covered in muscles. It's basically like a sponge with muscles around it that can squeeze blood into your system or relax to pull blood out of your system into the spleen. So if you get cut and you start bleeding, part of the reason you don't pass out is that your body detects the blood loss. It sends out signals, which either hormonal or through the nervous system, that cause the muscles around the spleen to squeeze, which pushes blood to replace the blood that you're losing through the cut, right? And that's how it holds it steady. So there's no just being is kind of, Parmenidean state of being alive. Everything about the reasons that you're alive is because of dialectics that push and pull, that struggle against each other. Now, it's not that it's impossible for people to have a dialectical view of the world in monotheism. It's just that it's not natural. It requires a very sophisticated understanding of monotheism to imagine a God who does things through struggle and dialectics. It's not the most obvious interpretation. If you're telling your toddler this is how the world works, and you say, well, there's only one God, they're not immediately going to assume, wow, there must be war going on all the time and struggle. Right? It sounds like a peaceful arrangement, right? Who would he be fighting with? Right? So it takes more sophistication to translate monotheism into a dialectical view of nature than it does to translate polytheism into a dialectical view of nature. The idea that Ares, right, and Athena might disagree with each other seems obvious. Even a kid could think, well, what if they don't agree with each other? I think it was Stephen earlier who posted in the chat, what would happen if the daimon that was writing the man came to dislike the man, right? The moment you have multiple entities, you can imagine, well, what if they like each other? What if they don't like each other? All these things naturally spring to mind, and they encourage you to ask the questions that the ancient worldview wants you to ask. The ancient worldview wants you, for everything that you look at in nature, whether it's around you or within you, to be asking, what's the struggle? What are the different powers that are pushing and pulling in order to make things the way that they are? Because if we understand that, then we have a mature adult relationship to our place in the world. We know that it's not going to be easy, that we have to pay a lot of attention, we have to learn a lot of things. And and that our conditions will change, and when they do, we have to change in response. We expect a world in flux from a polytheistic religion. It was an easy way, that is to say, to teach people to think about the relationships between different forces that have authority over you. So, you know, what is the relationship of the daimon, the lower class, the lower order of divinity, to these higher orders of divinities? Well, the first thing is that each divinity, part of what makes them a divinity is that they have authority over their subject matter, whether it's the ocean or the underworld or wisdom or hunting, or just you. In the case of your personal daimon, your daimon is the one that's, you know, when it comes to your character and what makes sense to you, that's not anybody else. That's not Athena, and it's not Zeus. It's not any of those. It's your daimon. Your daimon, being a divinity, actually has that authority. It's not just a middle manager. But it's that all forms of authority in the archaic perspective of the ancient worldview have to jostle with all other forms of authority, right? It's not a bunch of statues in a room. It's more like a rave and everybody's bouncing off each other. There's gonna be interactions, right? You know, you shoot the pool cue, you shoot and it ricochets off other balls that bounce off each other. And this is what it's like, except that the different forms of authority from the ancient perspective interpenetrate and pass through each other and change each other. So it's more like, you know, a red light and a green light, or a wind comes this way and a blast of water comes the other way and someone drops a rock into the middle. There's different kinds of forces that affect each other in different ways, but they do affect each other and they do pass through each other, right? So we can ask ourselves, for example, you know, the relationship between beauty and war. They can affect each other, right? If you read the Iliad, the descriptions of the beautiful armor or the incredibly beautiful athletic fighting prowess of Achilles, you know, or how he admired the beauty of Patroclus, his comrade in arms. It's not just sexual, right? The modern interpretation is, haha, they're sleeping together. But, you know, the ancient interpretation is, there is a beauty to things that are well done. And that even includes ugly things. So even something like war, and the Greeks had a lot of contempt for Ares. You see, he behaves like a coward a great deal in the Iliad. Nevertheless, the power of Ares creates a new condition in which beauty manifests in a different way, right? The beauty of Achilles is different from the beauty of a painting or of someone lounging in a delightful piece of clothing, right? That the context changes. These divinities all change the context for nature, and thereby they change the expression of all the other divinities at the same time. They interpenetrate each other. This is a mature adult perspective on the world in which, you know, life can be complicated. You have to take into account all the things that are coming into play. It's not a simple thought-terminating cliche of, you know, here's the answer, memorize the answer. Anytime someone asks a question, just say that answer. You can't take that approach with an ancient polytheistic, you know, religion. And that was the purpose of it to the ancients. They were trying to get people to ask these questions. So the daimon is a lower order of divinity strictly because its scope of action is the smallest. Your daimon's scope of action is just you. What makes sense to you? What do you like or not like? What do you easily spot in a situation? And what do you have difficulty noticing in a situation? All that stuff belongs to your daimon. And Zeus doesn't get a say in that. But if Zeus is in play, then your daimon is going to act out differently than if Zeus is not in play. right? If there's a war going on, your daimon is going to pay attention to different things than if there's not a war going on, and so forth. They affect each other in exactly the same way that the highest order of divinities affect each other too. Does that make sense, Geneva?
It absolutely makes sense. I love that answer. Thank you.
Yay. Okay, Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, things just got a little bit more complicated, as it always does. My thought is, like, I'll start by saying, I made the distinction, for instance, and the way you use the language, nature, between what I call nature one and nature two. I mean, it is dialectical. Nature one seemed to have a degree of resistance that's within its structure. And once the pressure goes beyond that, it does what it does, it caves, okay? The rock falls off the mountain, the atoms explode, the sun explodes, all that sort of thing. But nature too is different because it's organic, it's about life. And so there's another force that adds to it. And so nature resists, in a sense, this dialectic is a negation of, in some sense, a partial negation of nature one, in the sense that resists a one to persist. And so that's kind of important because it has this other dimension, don't just let it happen to you, just like resist and try to survive and do what you do, which is your mandate to grow and to live and reproduce the tree of life, so to speak. Then we have to distinguish between equal one and equal two, because once you have this mandate of life, then what happened is there are other species that have mandate of life that somehow there's a negotiation that goes on and they develop into ecosystem that in a sense affect each other. And so the number of ecosystems, but nonetheless, there's a kind of a network of things that in some sense build a kind of how's it, confederation of relationships that persists. Okay, I wouldn't call it a federation, a confederation of relationship. And when nature one acts in a certain way, and then the confederation breaks apart and forms different confederations. And then when you have human beings who have minds, then you have eco two, which is culture. Culture, in a sense, individual exists in this sort of semi-autonomous confederation of relationships that could develop and harden into, a more structure. But even then, it sort of struggles in a sense. And what is interesting is that I think I sort of slightly disagree with the Greeks, at least the way you explained it. And it comes out of my interpretation of Hegel. Because Hegel hated the idea of thesis, the idea, antithesis, the negation, and the synthesis, the confederation, okay, so to speak. What he sort of says is that the thesis, in some sense, the antithesis sublates the thesis, but the thesis never go away. So everything remains, is still sort of the semi-confederation with somewhat of a hierarchy, I suppose, the antithesis is dominant. But what happened when that's not lost, what the synthesis is like, I used to think of the America as a melting pot. Everybody becomes the same, right? You boil this soup until it gets really, really thick, and then suddenly There's no distinction. Now we realize that America, the political situation of this sort of symbiotic ecosystem, is one of sublation. Nothing disappears. It allows for these different things to exist more or less in a way in relationship to this confederation of relationships. And I think the daimon has this potential. It has this way of absorbing all the gods, but in different levels, okay? Which means that how Eco 2 deals with that is training and education, so that you could emphasize a certain. For instance, I'll give you an example. When I went to college, of course, I was leaning toward the arts, and I took a bunch of vocational interest tests and all sorts of things, and it came out that I was interested in all the humanities, particularly the arts and philosophy and so forth. But anything that has anything to do with money, it was like way, way low. And I remember saying to myself, better watch out, right? Because I haven't lost that. Just wasn't interested. It was in the background, but nonetheless, it remained there. And as I got older, that became a little bit more important because retirement's coming up. Be careful. So I became more wrapped up. Now particularly with the bubble bursting, a global economic crisis, I spent a lot of time dealing with that. And in many ways, it's like art. It's just very, very complex. There's many layers, parts. I could explain that, and I wanted to explain that, but I could explain that a different way. And I find that it is just incredibly complex, like art. When I talk to somebody about art, I know a lot about art, and it's hard to fool me, and even stuff that are new, because I have sort of embedded within myself a certain aesthetic, a certain idea that may be 100 years, 1,000 years, it may be displaced, but it sort of remains there. So when I go to a museum, I just look at the modern art, even though I don't understand fully, I'll always kind of sense, appreciate it, and sort of like, I'm still there, because even though it's changed. The economy is sort of that way, and I find how complex it is, and then I find, if I'm an amateur, I'm a sort of Sunday economist, like a Sunday painter, right? How in the hell am I going to compete with the expert, who knew the God of economies?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a thing you have to understand, that there are these different disciplines. You're not entirely out of it, but you understand, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think what education does is to provide a way for you to have enough freedom to, in a sense, either accentuate the positive or accentuate the negative. You're lacking in this area. Better learn something about this, right? Instead of an education system, this is what I hate about the contemporary education system, is that it's bearing down so much that you feel the pain, and your parents are telling you, you better go get a job, and that's good advice, okay? But on the other hand, it's like you become so paranoid. Everybody is like career oriented rather than sort of exploring the dimension of the daimonia.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So I think the culture has a lot to do with changing the structure of the ecosystem. And I think that's the problem. And you have to then understand, you know what? It's making a lot of things disappear that become invisible, that should be because the traces are still there.
Yeah.
And so I think what happened, I think what Plato sort of said, I actually don't totally agree with him, but there's a part of me, that's quite equalitarian. But there's a part of me that understands what he said. He's sort of saying the philosopher king is one who sort of is more open to the multidimensionality of the daimonia, so that they could, in a sense, understand the non-ego part. Now, he still have to divide a line. You can't go beyond the dividing line. To me, is the horizon, and so there's still a struggle. That's why, I mean, even the philosopher king, who's very wise, he is still not capable of ruling, because
Right.
he's still finite versus the infinite. So in some sense, but nonetheless, you're going to get closer to the horizon. Some people's horizon is very short, like right in front of your face. That's one of the reasons why, like, it's a joke, like the way you create a student is to hold a mirror in front of them and see if they fuck up the mirror.
Right.
They say, oh, pass. So in some sense, I think this really put a emphasis to underscore that the educational system, which is part of what society. Now, you don't have to have an educational system. You could just learn it on your own if you're very clever and sort of like observant. But education system takes what is already learned to expand what your consciousness could be, so that you sort of understand the otherness that's faded into the background, but it's still there. Otherwise, you are driven by your propensities. And I think what that does is that it becomes a problem. So
Yeah.
this is what I have to say about the fact that I kind of disagree. You're born with your diamond and that's all there is. No, your diamond is multidimensional. Oh, that's pretty good. Good. It sounds like a diamond, cut the glass, it sort of fragments into so, and suddenly it's like it was just a rock. And now it's like acculturated rock.
Yes.
With fractal dimensions. Okay, that's all I want to say. I'll drop my mic and let Donald talk.
Thanks, Phil.
Learn that.
So, you were talking about the relationship of nature and culture, and it just occurred to me, I didn't mention, I've been reading a lot of Hannah Arendt lately. I'm trying to get caught up on her work. After the backlash to Eichmann in Jerusalem, when people were offended that she described Eichmann as he really was instead of turning him into a cartoon villain, it changed the course of her career. And one of the things that she did is she wrote an essay specifically about that backlash. And it's in her book, Between Past and Future. It's essay 7. It's called Truth and Politics. And in it, she explores why it is that in culture, so often people set themselves against the truth. What is it about the truth that's a problem for people? And not just in an arm wavy, people like lies, people hate truth kind of way, but I mean exactly what's the issue. And she analyzes the different forms of truth there are. Specifically, truth that comes from principles, that anybody could, like pi, the relationship between pi and a circle's, geometry. Anybody can discover that for themselves. It doesn't require trust, right? Anybody can figure it out. But she says the problem is that most of what people need to learn in the realm of truth doesn't take the form of rational principles. It takes the form of completely unreasonable facts, things that happened. And they didn't happen because E equals MC squared. They just happened. And that they happened is true. The thing really occurred. But there's no way for anybody who wasn't there at the time to go back to their private library and read up in Euclid and draw some circles and get a protractor out and go, oh, I see. The hummingbird really did suck the nectar out of that flower at 2:15 p.m. Like literally, it's unprovable. It's it's untrustworthy. It's a kind of truth that is rude in its unwillingness to accommodate our systems of thought. You either take it or leave it, but if you leave it, you're out of sync with reality. You're just wrong. But there was no way for you to be right other than to be there at that moment. And she says almost all truth is this kind of factual truth, right? It's contingent on things that are never going to happen again. It was just that moment because the world is so complex. And then she talks about how cultural truths work very differently. That in culture, it is the process of developing consensus that creates cultural truth. Things are not culturally true unless we talk about them together and we agree as a culture, okay, this is how it's going to be. We're just going to behave this way. We're going to, we hold these truths to be self-evident. No, all men are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? We agree as a culture, and that makes it true for us as a culture. And the problem with factual truth is that it, as Kafka warned us, basically, he said, it's rude. It disrespects cultural authority. It disrespects politics. The king can't proclaim out of existence something just because he doesn't like it. Whereas cultural truths he can, right? As long as he's got the culture's backing. The same is true if it's not a king, but if it's a democracy, if it's the whole group of people together, they can change their mind about what color of clothing is in or what shape of hat is in, but they can't change their mind about whether somebody did a certain thing at a certain time in a certain place, because nature doesn't care about their vote. It doesn't care about their majority. It doesn't care about all that work that they invested their entire personality into. I want to be liked. I want to be popular. I want to get people to agree with me. Nature is just absolutely doesn't care at all. And as a result, she says, in Truth and Politics, it is surprisingly common for political movements and social movements and cultures generally to turn their back on facts because they're offended by them. And I don't mean personally offended, but I mean because the facts are rude. They won't play the game that all the members of the culture are required to play in order to agree about things. There's a way in which nature and reality are our villain. They're our antagonist who directly flout the rules that the rest of our lives utterly depend upon. It's really a very interesting essay. I'd never really looked before at this issue of the different kinds of truth and which ones go along with our social political norms and which ones don't, and how do people respond to that. But I think you would enjoy it. And that's the link to the Internet Archive. You can rent it an hour at a time and read it. That's what I've been doing. So, let's see, Stephen says, this is the Hannah Arendt who in 1933 believed the land of Schiller and adopted Shakespeare could not possibly plumb the depths of barbarism. Yeah, well, yeah. So, as we talked about last time, Hannah Arendt had this problem where she kept being surprised that the modern world was going to do things that she thought it utterly wouldn't do, that are out of its character. And it turns out, no, that is its character. It's not what we thought it was. Is in this way, reading Hannah Arendt is kind of like reading Nietzsche, where over the course of her career, her perspective changes because she learns from the Holocaust. She learns from the French Resistance. She learns from the backlash to Eichmann in Jerusalem. And her later works say things that in her earlier work she never would have said. It's the same reading Nietzsche. Donald, go ahead.
Well, I would like to offer kind of a reading of the first sentence that's maybe a little more amenable to moderns. Not that I'm going to change the meaning, but we remember Kenneth is presenting how the Greeks viewed this, not of course how we view it, although because he sets up there sort of a ratio proportion. Kenneth, I'll say, Stephen, you should pay attention. This is rationality in a limited sense coming in here. That instincts are to animals are as, we won't say daemons because we're moderns. X is to human beings. and that X is the source of our impulses to see or want things as we do. And so we can then say that X, well, the Greeks called it daemons, that each person had a daemon. You know, but what's kind of critical there is that even for moderns, we experience phenomenologically, existentially, whatever you want to say, regardless of your philosophical stance, these impulses within ourselves. Even other Greeks talked about them as like coming from the abdomen, the thumos or whatever, these urges. And so we can sort of look at this, and it doesn't matter. I mean, even if we want to call it unconsciousness or, you know, following Freud or some other famous I've not studied much about psychology or psychologists. I do have a wife that has the complete works of Freud, and I'll have to say his case studies do make fantastic reading, but I never paid much to his conceptual structure. It's just the weird people he met and how he worked through their whatever they had, I don't know. But we can sort of see this, even if we sort of, in modern philosophy, like hermeneutics, this would say, let's bracket the word daemon. We don't know what it is, but we don't need to, because we do know what these impulses are, and all of us can experience them. Now, he also goes on a little bit further down. I like where each person is somewhat blind to their own daemon. It doesn't come within that genothe se auton, but to some extent they're visible to others. Not the daemon isn't visible. What's visible is our impulses. For us, they're just part of our metabolism. But for others, they see, well, you always go to the right, or you always go to the left, or you always like sour things, not sweet things, or whatever. We don't need to have that. But these things can be understood in a more modern fashion. Not that that's what Kenneth is. Well, he kind of is. He's trying, let's see how the Greeks look at this and see if it doesn't wake up in moderns this idea that, well, I don't know about daemons, but I sure do have unknown impulses that drive what I do.
And then
you've got sort of, you've got there about, I think Kenneth would say, you know, if you've got that much enlightenment, you're well on your way. Because the normal state of the modern is that, well, I just will this stuff. I create these things ex nihilo, you know, create myself. You know, and the first step here is to understand, like the Greeks, that we don't do that. Being part of nature. Now, and I think instincts, as he's pointed out many times before to animals, drive animals or ride animals or perform the daemon role in a way that's far less erring. It drives them to their natural human, their natural arete or whatever, you know, their greatness. Animals act in ways that are beneficial to themselves almost all the time. They're kind of unerring. Whereas, as he's pointed out before, for human beings, these drives that aren't nearly so unerring. In fact, they fail almost always. They blind us. Anyway, that's just for people, I think, that have trouble with, sort of, oh, we're getting into Greek religion, and what does this have to do with us? Well, you can look at this as what's the phenomena, the thing, which is just as valid now as it was then.
Right.
And the explanation, oh, there's a hierarchy of gods and their daemons, and everybody has one. You could say that to me is not quite, it's more perceptive than say, well, Freud said everybody has an unconscious and it drives them. Well, the unconscious is well, if it were conscious, if we knew what was in there, it wouldn't be the unconscious.
Right.
So we do recognize this hidden source of drives or energy within us.
Right.
And what we have to do is avoid the blindness, the delusion, whatever. But, there's also the thing that other people can see this sometimes better than we can. So they always say, it's good. We will say, moderns do say, you need to know yourself as others know you. Well, that's hard. It's hard to do. It's hard to know yourself, yet alone to know yourself as others might know you. But you can see where the enlightenment, the additional knowledge you've gained, comes from. And that's enough about this. And Kenneth, Sharon, this was for you. I was reading the text and expounding on it.
Taking us back to the text for Sharon. I appreciate it. Thanks, Donald. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, is that they may be using religious metaphors like the daimon to explain this, but what they're trying to explain is something that we have as moderns too, which is, where the hell does our behavior come from? Why do we want some things and not others? Why do we behave the way that we do? And as Donald says, it's not just invisible to us, but it's so invisible to us as to be in a really strange, paradoxical way that others can look at us and see the very things about ourselves that we ourselves can't see. So, the fact that some people see a picture of a small, cute animal, and every single time they're going to go, oh, it's so adorable. And other people won't. But the people who get to know them start to anticipate them and send them pictures of little cute animals so that they can be ready to hear that. Oh, it's so cute, right? Because they know it's coming. Even the person might not know that, in 30 seconds, they're about to say those words, but the person is about to give them the picture of the cute little bunny rabbits could set their watch. Here it comes, right? It's like, I can see this part of you, and I can see the impact that we're going to have on each other. Kenneth Smith really enjoys the writings of Oliver Sacks, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and all of his other books, where Sacks is talking about different kinds of dysfunction in the brain that because of those cases, we now know that's a function of the brain. And if it weren't for those people making those strange mistakes in their interpretation of reality, we wouldn't even know that that was something the brain had to do, right? Our understanding of intelligence, because we're so familiar with being intelligent beings, we're just terrible at figuring out the anatomy of our intelligence. What are the different faculties involved and how do they affect each other? And it starts to sound like polytheism, right? One faculty affects another faculty and changes the way that it interprets the world. And what's interesting about the cases that Oliver Sacks picks out is that these people, by missing one specific faculty, you can say, well, how do all of the other faculties behave in the absence of just this one that now we can say something about the character of? So one way to think about that is in medical terms, that he's describing anatomy and physiology of the brain. But more generally, he's describing character. These are people who, for physiological or anatomical reasons, their character isn't the same as ours. And they engage in behavior. Sometimes they're aware of it and sometimes they aren't. But that Oliver Sacks is aware of it. And when he describes it to you, you're like, well, yeah, that's conspicuous. And yet you see the extent to which the sufferer of the various conditions might not even know that they were having this problem. And you think what we have here is a metaphor for every other aspect of human character. All the non-pathological, non-physiological, non-anatomically driven, but nevertheless character-based, decisions or impulses or drives or wants or awarenesses, all of that works the same way as the kinds of things Oliver Sacks is talking about, where we can't see it in ourselves nearly as clearly as we can see it in somebody else, or somebody else could see it in us. Again, the realm of the invisible and how it shapes the visible. So I'm going to call Stephen in just a second, but part of the reason why the Greeks used daimon as, a personality, a divine personality as a metaphor here is, well, you look at moderns and our tendency to say, oh, the body's a machine and the brain is a computer and food is fuel. We have a tendency to think in static terms, right? Because one thing that an amoeba can do that no machine can do is an amoeba can detect the circumstances around itself and change directions and change itself and say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to do something completely different. Now, I'm not just talking about a simple switch, like, if else in a programming language. I'm talking about things like, the amoebas can decide that they're all going to gather together and form a slime mold and go on the move somewhere, which is like radically different. The way that the degree, the extent to which they're rewriting themselves and transforming themselves to be alive to the circumstances around them is organismic in a way that's the opposite of the mechanical qualities of a machine, where it does what it does and it doesn't do what it doesn't do. And what the Greeks want us to understand is human character is not a program. It's not a machine. It's not an object. It's more like a living organism. It's adapting, it's sensing, it's reacting to things. And among the things it's doing is it's growing and changing over time. This is where Geneva's question about free will and determinism comes into play. That the character isn't like a program. It's not like ROM, that boots up your computer when you start. And it's not like Microsoft Word that's going to do certain things to your document. It's more like a living thing with a personality that's different from yours and can have different goals from yours. So Stephen's earlier amusing question about, well, what if your daimon doesn't like you, is exactly the kind of question the ancients want you asking about your own character. Your character is not your slave. It is not subject to your will. You can have profound disagreements with your character without you ever knowing you have that disagreement. And yet the implications totally shape the way you see the world and feel and the choices that you make. So they're trying to create this complex dynamic with a very simple metaphor, a very simple, easy to understand way to think about your character that nevertheless opens up the right questions. And they find the easiest way to do that is to treat the character like it's somebody else. It's got an identity and a personality of its own, and it has authority over the parts of yourself that are invisible to you. Why you notice this and not that? Why do you always reach for peanuts, but you don't want to have anything to do with walnuts? Why? Where does all this come from? Well, it comes from your daimon, they say. And there's a certain amount of power that comes from that metaphor. And the most crucial of which being, why did they say know thyself at the Oracle of Delphi? It's because you can change it if you can learn about it and enter a dialogue with it. That feedback loop is where the real power is in this daimon model that we're going to come to. Stephen and then Bob. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was going to say, the early recollections I had when I was about 5 months old or something like that was a state where I didn't have an episodic memory. I was being wheeled along in a baby carriage. My mother was there. I didn't know what my mother was, except that out of the fog, and this is a thing, I looked at a tree, I just saw a fog. I had no concept for trunk or branch or leaf or twig that would order the sensory sort of experience I was having. I didn't know what another human was. I sensed myself via my nervous system or whatever, that I was a certain thing. My mother would come out of the fog and I felt, oh, there's a comforting presence which is more like me than the other voluminous clouds that are all around. I had my perception, I had an idea of contrast between the sky was lighter above and it was darker down below. I think vaguely it was colours that were peeking out. So the tree was a peculiar sort of greyness, and this greyness was a bit different, and that greyness was a bit different. It tended to be repetitive experiences that build up strongly, but eventually I was able to create a picture of the world. But I still didn't have episodic memory. And for example, I wanted to there was an urge in me to strengthen my conscious awareness, but there was a problem. I would fall asleep occasionally. And when I would wake up, the work had been lost. Then bang, one day have the repetitive experience of going into this house again. I suddenly wake up, I've been here before. Oh, this is fantastic. I can recollect episodes of the past. Bang, instantly I can abstract that into possible episodes of the future from memory to thought. So it's consciousness, memory, and then thought.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can understand what this guy says when there's a person who lacks a certain perceptive awareness in the mind. Yeah, I've experienced it, so I know it's there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's part of what's interesting about this existentialist tradition that goes back through Hegel to Heraclitus and others, is rather than sorting the world into the good people and the bad people, coincidentally putting ourselves among the good people and the people we don't like among the bad people, which is how a lot of ideologies and so on do things. The Hegelian approach says we all grow and develop through certain stages. And, rather than pointing the finger at those people over there and look at the bad things they do, it's more constructive to do what you did, Stephen. And we look back at our own lives and say, can I remember a time when can I remember a time when it was like life and death to me? I cared so deeply whether my friends liked me, and I would let them guide me into doing almost anything. And what was it that made me start to not be satisfied with that anymore? And what kinds of trouble did I have to get into before I started to say, hey, this isn't working. Maybe I need to create some distance between myself and my longing to be approved by my friends. I do remember those things. I remember the trouble I got into, and I can remember feeling so confused about how things could have gone wrong, when after all, wasn't I pleasing them? Didn't I do what they wanted? How could my parents be angry at me now? It didn't make sense. and they'd ask me, why did you do that? And I would say in this bewildered tone, I don't know. It was true. I didn't know why I was doing it. There's so much to be gained by looking at the process of development of the human personality and character and intelligence within our own lives. It helped, among other things, it helps avoid the simplistic, this group will go to heaven and that group will go to hell kind of dynamics that passes for politics in the modern world too often. And partly it's just, I think we see the world in more interesting ways when we can learn that the thesis and the antithesis are not just two things that happen to be squabbling, but that the antithesis grew out of the thesis as a necessary stage of development that could only have grown out of it by negating the previous stage. There's really interesting things about the way that the blossom forms from the bud that apply well to our understanding of personality and culture. Bob, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, help me some here because I'm kind of new. So if I say something that's not, but I heard you describe, well, I ultimately have a question, but I heard you describe that the culture changes and that we need to put ourselves in the mindset of the past culture, the evolving cultures, and the present day culture. But then you just now described also from what people were saying, how the individual daemon evolves and learns based as it goes along. And I was then wondering, how does, since there's 8 billion people or 7.5 billion people on the earth, or 350 million in the nation, how these evolving individual daemons interact in such a way that they emerge an overall culture that then is the greater God that feeds back on the individual and limits the individual daemons. How does that greater loop work?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. Thank you. Yeah, this is all very Hegelian, right? And to say that it's Hegelian in this sense is to say that it's an ancient perspective, right? Because the ancient Greeks didn't use the object or the machine as their metaphor. They used the organism as their metaphor. So if you're saying, well, what is a culture? The ancient perspective, the ancient response by default wouldn't be, well, it's a thing, or it's a machine or a mechanism or a set of laws. It would be, well, it's an organism, right? And this organism learns and grows and changes over time. So if that's an organism and the individual character is also an organism, then as you say, how does the collection of multiple individual organisms create a culture? How are they related to each other? How does that all work? And part of it is for us a challenge, because like a character in a tragedy, we don't find ourselves at the beginning where we can just make tidy notes about what develops and say, well, this is where everything came from. Instead, we're in the middle and a whole bunch of things have already developed. And we don't know what those things were that were important for getting us to where we find ourselves. So we don't find ourselves in a position of individuals that we can one by one put together and see how they create a culture. We instead find ourselves in a position in which there's already a culture and individuals. And unteasing their relationship to each other is some of the trickiest work there is to do in science and philosophy. But some of it that we can see, the Greeks believed in a concept called kairos, which is the time in which things matter. Kairos, the concept of kairos is, it's related to why do some companies succeed and other companies fail. And people who succeed in creating companies and get rich will often tell you, well, it's because of my hard work and because I was well trained and we sacrificed to make this happen. They'll give you this list of things, but what they leave out is a whole bunch of the companies that failed did all those same things. So if that was all there was to it, we should have a lot more successes than we do. And the Greeks said, yeah. And the reason is, in certain times, the same action that you take that normally doesn't go anywhere, now it will get traction and it'll go somewhere. That the times are not the same. And the reason why the times are not the same is something that we'd have to investigate. But the question is, what are those things that make it accumulate and make a difference? So individual action. If I wish that the culture would change to become different, and I go out into the world and I try to change it, if it is not a period of kairos, then my actions aren't going to result in a change in the culture. But if it is a period of kairos, then my actions will catch on. My suggestion for the change will catch on and the culture will change. And so your question goes to the heart of, well, why? Why then and not at other times? Why? How does this work? And one way that we described it is, there's a law of big numbers that says that even things that you understand completely, like say a hydrogen atom. So you've mapped out the proton and the electron. You figured out what are the different ions that are possible for this thing. What are the different isotopes and how do they all be? You've got a complete map. You now know hydrogen inside and out. But the problem is, you start putting enough hydrogen atoms together, and they start doing things that you could never have predicted from an individual hydrogen atom. Like they might form a star, right? You might suddenly fusion. You get enough and you get gravity and fusion starts to take place and hydrogen is generating helium. And you go back and look at your earlier stuff on hydrogen and say, where the hell did that come from? That was nowhere, right? In my list of characteristics of hydrogen. But it's because when their behavior is compatible and reinforcing each other, the wave effect of new behavior gets larger. They can produce qualitatively different phenomena. This is called emergence. You've probably run into this concept before, that when situations get extremely complex, new laws of nature seem to emerge out of nowhere. New properties seem to emerge out of nowhere. So like chemistry has its own laws that can't be broken down to just physics. And biochemistry has its own laws that can't be broken down to just chemistry. And cellular biology has its own laws that can't be broken down to just biochemistry. It's because the number of things that are acting has become so large that they're able to reinforce each other in ways that produce qualitative change. So when it comes to human beings and the relationship between a character and a culture, the issue on Kairos is this: are those human beings en masse acting in ways in which they reinforce each other's actions, or are they acting in ways that cancel each other's actions out? So if I really want to do, let's take a simple example of say me and Phil both have ideas about what we want to change in our culture. We're a tiny culture of two people. And I desperately want it to go one way, but Phil desperately wants it to go the other. Now, no matter how hard we act, the culture isn't going to change because we're canceling each other out. This is that issue of Kairos in action. But if he and I both wanted it, or were at least amenable to it, then our actions could reinforce each other and might be capable of generating the energy required to transform our relations going forward. So there's these issues of Kairos and emergence and complexity that are involved. Go ahead, Bob.
So it seems that global social media is changing that dynamic globally.
Yes.
Because you can share massive, instead of just you two having a communication, it can then go viral and
Yes.
affect many people. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden, the whole world is seeing their wife as a hat.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. After Oliver Sacks's book caught on, the phrase, mistook his wife for a hat, which previously didn't mean anything to anybody on earth except Oliver. After that, it means something to millions of people. They're like, oh yeah, I know what he means, right? But you talk to somebody from 40 years back and they're like, what are you talking about? That's not even a thing. The culture's changed now, right? So what we're doing right here on Zoom wasn't possible before the internet. We're all in different cities.
So it's affecting our culture, which is affecting a greater God. Greater
Effectively,
demos.
yeah, the character of the culture is like a daimon. It's like a divinity. It's affecting all of the people in it. And then there's a feedback loop between the daimon of the culture and your personal daimon, which is your own character, right? So some people might see the changes in the culture and go, I'm here for that. This is my jam. I'm my character wants this and I want to reinforce it and strengthen it. But I might have the other kind of character. I might see these changes and get bitter and angry and try to organize with other people to stop it, right? It could happen.
Well, I better get my character in order then.
This is the ancient perspective, right? This is why they say Gnothe se auton. You want to get in there and start gardening your character. If you read Voltaire's Candide, there's where they're talking about whether you should be an optimist or a pessimist. The conclusion towards the end of the book is you should tend your garden, and it's a metaphor for your character, right? You should whatever else you do in the world, you should definitely be working on trying to cultivate your character in a healthy direction, because that's what's going to be in charge whenever you're not paying attention, which is most of the time. I can only look at 7 plus or minus 2 things. There's an infinite number of things I'm not looking at, and my daimon is in charge of all that. So I better cultivate that daimon.
Yeah. So all the while, my culture is telling me that my wife is actually a hat.
Right. Exactly. So, what I like about these metaphors is that even though they're using, religion and mythology and so forth as their metaphors to work with, the introduction of an organismic personality-like metaphor allows us to account for an enormous amount of complexity in ways that, can make us ask interesting questions. That's what's so surprising to me. And it goes to the heart of why this book even exists, is the modernist orthodoxy is that the past is a bad version of the present, right? They're primitive and we're advanced. They were ignorant and we're knowledgeable, right? Everything is in this great march of progress from the bad, stupid slime to the great, noble, magnificent ourselves. And when we imagine a future, there goes Star Trek, we'll be just like ourselves, but even more so, even better, will we be like gods flying through the stars. And the problem with this is it's so self-aggrandizing and self-flattering that it creates enormous blind spots as to our own character as a culture. It discourages us from asking questions like, I wonder what we're getting wrong. I wonder what we're not seeing about the world. We don't even ask those questions because all of our basis of comparison is, well, everybody else was worse than us. So who cares? We win, right?
Oh, one last thing. I read a aphorism from a French philosopher. Progress is a hypocrisy that refines the vices.
Yes. Who was that? Do you remember?
No, I could probably find it. Well, actually,
Yeah, I
just
like
Google that. You Google that, and you'll find him.
Yeah. I'll look for that.
Progress is a hypocrisy that refines the vices.
That's beautiful. Yeah, exactly right. So, this is the point of this book is, we look back and we expect from our modernist catechism, we expect to find that their take on human rights, on free will versus determinism, on the relationship between the group and the individual, any important question, modernism tells us that old answers to these questions will be inferior answers. And the farther back we go, the stupider they'll be. But instead, we find this description of free will and determinism that's more sophisticated than most of what you'll find if you Google free will and determinism today on the internet. Most moderns think about the relationship between the group and the whole, or between how much choice do I have, in ways that are much more, what do I want to say? Much less expressive, much less able to describe the complexity we see in the world than this 2,500-year-old metaphor of time onates. It's like, this is what Kenneth is saying. It's not that history works the way that we've been taught. Instead, it's that each epoch has its characteristic strengths and weaknesses about the way it sees the world. And so, even though there will come a time when he'll go after the tool metaphor, in general, to start with, he's encouraging a tool metaphor. Just saying, rather than thinking of the modern worldview as the right answer and all the other worldviews as the wrong answers, we should think about them as different tools and want to have them in our toolkit. It's nice to have a hammer, but if the problem is, you need to screw something in, and all you ever do is reach for a hammer, you're gonna make a mess, right? This is the point of this book. And so, we start by studying the ancient worldview, the medieval worldview, and the modern worldview, and it changes our relationship to these worldviews. And so that we can start to become collectors and connoisseurs, evaluators, judges of worldviews, instead of merely being subject to the one we happen to have been born in. That's what the whole book's about. That's what he's doing. Phil, go ahead. Come off. Oh, you are off mute. Yeah, tell us what you have on your mind.
Yeah, just in passing, Bob, I think that might be Foucault. But in any event, I want to get to the essence of what you've been talking about. Dialectical thinking is really the negation of the negation that is sort of not a negativism, but a positivism through negation. And let's start out with the fact that, we experience things, the phenomena. The phenomena is not the real thing, but it's our direct contact. As a matter of fact, when your kids are young, very young, you have to have a lot of toys around that's colorful, so they begin to develop this sort of like more sophisticated understanding of the phenomenal world. And that out of that emerges concepts and minds and memory and all that sort of stuff, right? So we're dealing with a situation in which things unfold from each other. So when you negate the flower, you're not saying that the flower is not the flower. That's not what you're saying. You're negating it so you can get the seed. I mean, that's a point. It's a dynamic rolling through, okay? And so once you understand that, in a sense, it developed in the ideas themselves have to negate itself in order to progress. So this is really a kind of biological metaphor in terms of the development of ideas as well. There's somehow there's a sympathetic relationship in the development of nature unfolding as a development of ideas unfolds. Now, the problem is that once you get to a point of the unfolding and you turn up the amplitude to 11, as you were talking about, what happened is the unfolding of the dialectic is a sublation of the previous, but it doesn't disappear, okay? And so you have to deal with this sort of dialectic in a very subtle and sensitive way. Because once you turn it up to 11, what happened is that sublation becomes oppression and domination, which is exactly what happened in colonialism, right? So you have to understand that, for instance, if you had not sublated the American Indians, the so-called more primitive people, they're primitive because they're not as technologically developed. But on the other hand, they have a more direct relationship with nature. And what happened when you turn it up to 11 and colonialism and you wipe out the connection, then in a sense, what happened is that actually disappears. You actually have negated rather than sublated the situation. So now the roots are cut and you're not back to where you are, which is the final direction is getting direct contact with nature itself in some sense. We have created such a gap in terms of the amplitude, both in terms of every instance, but a compilation of, let's say, how should I say, the what they call in economics, the accumulation of inflation that increases the amplitude. So now we are not connected to nature at all. We just merely see it as a product, right, to be used. It's not something out of which we grow. Fortunately, some people have realized that, oh, ecology is actually trying to connect us back to nature in its way. And so in some sense, if somehow you could disconnect it, so you have, in fact, a structure in which everybody has sublated reality to such a degree that your wife does become a hat. Now, it did become that in a way, because I think in the 70s, there was a movie called Stafford Wives, which is pretty much the same thing, right? Your wife has become a mechanical robot because she's behaving perfectly as you wish her to be. Subservient, obedient, all that kind of stuff, right? And that's what you want. We all want that because the culture has told us that that's what it is. That's a perfect wife. But unfortunately, she's no longer human. And I think I think that has become a problem. We have detached then the idea and turn sublation into essentially the domination of our desires. And that's why I mean you can never forget about the otherness. It's difficult to do that because we all are, to some degree at least, more or less, selfish because we want to survive as well. But nonetheless, you have to also understand the negative space that is part of the whole. And once you get rid of the negative space, then in a sense, you don't understand what the context it is, because it's become totally synthetic.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes a problem. I think Hegel got it right, but I don't think he put enough emphasis on the amplitude, and I think you have to tweak those dial carefully, because even when you play with computer art, your computer, whatever, you could change the color. If you tweak it too much, it just looked unnatural. But I guess if you get used to being the natural, that's why, I remember when I was watching TV, and I have that habit too, like to turn up the contrast a bit to make things clearer. But it's not at all like the way reality is, right?
Right.
And if you get to such a point, then what it does become is becomes a hard edged black and white. Like
Yeah.
you've seen those kind of pictures. So you have to turn it subtle enough. Maybe you could boost it a little because it sort of maybe nature needs just a little bit of boosting.
Just a little. Just a
Yeah,
touch.
right. But on the other hand, if you boost it too much, it becomes like no longer what you want. It really becomes a true dialectic, like
Right.
either positive or negative. That's it. That's all you have. And
Yeah.
I think that's a problem, is that we have lost a sense of subtlety in our relationship with the world and with otherness, right? And is that gentle gradation in between that actually portray the world as it is.
Thank you, Phil. So let's dive into the rest of the sentences in this paragraph. The opening is where the real shock is, as we get all these new concepts. But once the concepts are in place, the rest of it follows naturally, as again a portrayal of the ancient perspective on human character. So it says, each of us has from birth a godling, that's the daimon, intimately attached to us, and only us, right? This is our godling. This is the God of our character, prompting a certain quality of insight and subtly nudging our lives in a certain direction. And this goes back to things we talked about in the first couple sections in chapter 4, that the Greeks had a teleological concept of nature. Things aren't just randomly happening, but under the organismic model of nature, everything in nature has certain drives within it, tendencies to go in certain directions. Everything in nature has a certain character that determines what it pays attention to and doesn't pay attention to, what it wants or doesn't want, whether it's an amoeba or a tree or this cat sleeping on my lap. And if we understand the world that way, then concepts like teleology and fate become more interestingly complex, right? So the amoeba has a teleology that leads it towards the bacteria that it wants to feed upon, right? It smells, without a nose, but with its membrane, it smells the cyclic adenosine monophosphate that's emitted by the, not the camp, it smells, what is it that it smells? Now I'm forgetting. It can smell the B vitamins that are the result of the metabolism of the bacteria that are emitted in the environment. It pursues the gradient of the highest B vitamins. I forget which one specifically it is. And if it follows that, it leads it to the bacterium, which it then engulfs and eats. So it has a teleology in that it is driven in a direction, but it's not a teleology if we think in childish terms and say, well, does it tell me the ending of the story? The answer is, well, no, because all it's moving around and all the bacteria are moving around and the environment is breaking down the B vitamins and all these other things are changing at the same time. So you don't get to know in advance what the final sentence of the book is, who done it. That's not what teleology is, because this amoeba isn't the only thing with a teleology. So does everything else have a teleology. It's the interactions of all these teleologies that determine the outcome, not any one of them in isolation, because we don't live in a vacuum. So there's in modernity, you can Google objections to teleology, and you'll find huge numbers of philosophers who will tell you that teleology is an outdated concept and it's ridiculous. But the thing that they think is outdated is their own ridiculous caricature of the ancient perspective on teleology, which was actually really sophisticated, as we can see from this discussion. So when he talks about subtly nudging our lives in a certain direction, there's a word that Kenneth Smith likes to use. He's not using it here, but he'll use it elsewhere. And that term is fatal. Fatal. And by fatal, he doesn't mean it killed you. He means this is something that has to do with your ultimate fate. This isn't the answer to the final sentence in the book. Bye, JK. Good talking to you. This isn't the answer to who done it in the book. But for something to be fatal means that it is affecting your outcome. It is affecting your fate. It's part of the the mix along with your teleology and other things that's driving you towards however things are going to come out, whatever that may be. So when he says it's subtly nudging your life in a certain direction, he doesn't mean that your life is going to end up over there. There could be other forces in your life that push you completely the opposite direction. But those forces will have to overcome this subtle nudging in that direction. And if the forces ever let up, you'll turn back into that direction and start moving that way again. That's what he's talking about here when he talks about how the daimon steers you. It doesn't steer you by picking an outcome and teleporting you to that location. It just is a constant pressure pushing that way that has to be factored in along with all the other pressures in your life. So, okay. So then he says,
Rick, could I interrupt just briefly because this is kind of important. The problem with when you think about teleology is you have a sentence and the sentence ends with a period. I'm saying in a dynamic system, there shouldn't be a period there. There should only be a semicolon on to the next one. The semicolon is the perfect answer to the period because it's just a quick stop, hesitation, and then move on, to rethink that situation. So think semicolon. That's all I wanted.
I like that. Thank you, Phil. David will appreciate the quote I'm about to do. Writer Alan Moore created a comic book along with artist Dave Gibbons back in the 80s called Watchmen. There have been distorted versions of it that have shown up as a movie, but the original Watchmen has an enormous amount going on that's missing from the movie. And it's turns out to be a story about a scheme to try to save the world by uniting everybody against an imaginary threat. And at the end, the guy who was behind it all, trying to get everybody united, who had to do terrible things along the way, he asks another character who's almost godlike in his power, and that's why he's asking him. I did it all right in the end, though, right? I mean, all the sacrifices that I made, it was okay, right? It came out in the end. And the guy looks at him and says, nothing ever ends. It's just what you said, Phil, right? You need a semicolon, not a period. That when people do simplistic distinctions about ends and means and say, well, the ends doesn't justify the means. It's like, yeah, well, part of the reason is there's no period, just semicolons, right? The end flows into something else. And the means aren't in a separate category. They happened too. They're also among the ends. So, the terrible sacrifices we make to achieve something don't go away just because we achieve that thing. Because we didn't just achieve that thing, we also achieved the sacrifices, and they maintain their own momentum in the world, their own impact and effects, right? The law of unintended consequences. All right, so each daimon is, according to legend, situated behind the head of its human subject, steering him as a rider does a horse. So people sometimes describe alcoholism or other really unfortunate characteristics as saying he has a monkey on his back. He has a monkey on his back. This is an allusion to the myth of the daimon. Who's riding you? You'd like someone wise to be riding you, someone compassionate. What you don't want is an idiot that flings poo riding you. It's like, who knows what's going to happen next? This chattering thing is going to be, ooh, shiny, right? I mean, you don't know. You don't want to have a monkey riding your back. You don't want a bad daimon. You want a good daimon. So this is when he's talking about this is what he's talking about. So steering him as a rider does a horse, right? And by this, he doesn't mean as a bad rider does a horse by clomping in the spurs and whipping it. He means as an excellent rider. Remember, these are gods. This is an exquisite, exceptional, outstanding rider, rides a horse so well that the horse thinks it's its idea to turn left or right or speed up or slow down. Just like we think we're in conscious control of the things that we're doing. We don't understand that what we saw and what we were interested in was nudged into us in advance by our character. And that's what determined the outcome. That's why we were even headed in that direction in the first place. That's what he's alluding to here. We cannot consciously detect the bias of our individual enthusiasms and aversions, but others, looking at the indirect evidence of our patterns of preferences and blindness, can infer what sort of daimon we are liable to. Right? So this is like reading Oliver Sacks's books. They may not know that they've mistook their wife for a hat, but we're clear that wife is not a hat, and you don't seem to know that. And so now I've learned something about your character that you don't seem to know about yourself, right? This issue of the invisible being visible to others, even when it isn't to ourselves. It's fascinating, right? It's fascinating that we are more blind to ourselves than others are to us. And they're more blind to themselves. I should be saying invisible, not blind, I think here. But you get my point, right? It's paradoxical that all of this behavior is coming out into the commons where anybody could look at it, but the person least qualified to see what's evident to everybody else is their own behavior and personality. It's very strange. It's really unfortunate for Homo sapiens that the thing we're least able to see is ourselves. That others see us far more clearly. Not always more accurately. They may not know what the behavior means, but they see it, right? They see the pattern of it because their daimon isn't our daimon, right? The things that are invisible to them aren't the things that are invisible to us. And going back to Bob's question earlier about the culture, granted, all of these daimons, all these characters that are arising within the character of the culture are going to be imprinted by that culture. It's true. But culture isn't the only source of character. There's genetics, there's family traditions, there's unique experiences that we had that somebody else didn't have that can overlay the imprint of the culture's character with something specific. And thus you can get weird countercultural figures who at first glance you might think they seem out of step with their time, but then when you get to know them better, you understand why they're out of step with this time and not some other time, because they're in reaction against it, negating, right, some part of the culture. That if they were in a different culture that didn't have that feature, they couldn't have all this energy about negating it. It wouldn't be a thing. It'd be a non-issue. All right. So then he adds a sort of a coda to this paragraph. He says, in Socrates' trial, this notion of a spiritual guide, a daimon, entered the corpus of world literature. But Socrates' daimon is anomalous or atypical. So if we want to understand the ancient Greek concept of character and the daimon, we're not going to get it by reading Plato's account of Socrates, because Socrates is describing something different from what everybody else believed in. In fact, that's how he got in trouble. That was part of where Athens was angry at him. Is you're messing with the core issues of the religion at a level that we think is dangerous. It was a matter of faith, and an important one to the ancient Greeks, that the daimon works the way it does and not the way that Socrates said his worked. The fact that he could have a conversation with his daimon was the thing that, to use the modern parlance, offended Athens. The daimon specifically works through your unconscious, not through your conscious. It's the God over the things about yourself you don't see, not somebody you take to lunch and have a conversation with. And I it's hard to know why Socrates talked about this the way that he did, but that's a much longer discussion. Stephen, go ahead. You got your hand up.
The worry is the tendency to not reflect on long-term consequences. Now look at this, this war in the Ukraine. And the West, generally via its media, has adopted the position, we are liberal democracy. We are the finest of what human beings can be. We are the light, and all the others are the darkness. The Russians are the darkness, the Chinese are the darkness, the Indians are the darkness, the Islam is the darkness, all these other, we're the light.
Yes.
And, so the important thing in Ukraine is first we must push the Russians out, because they're our Ukrainians are the new project to become enlightened like us. So first of all, we must help them push the Russians out. Then Vladimir Putin, the darkness, must fall from power, and then Russia must mend its ways and become our devotees. And then we might forgive them. I recall years ago when I was arguing with a friend about the American invasion of Iraq, and I was saying that, look, you're facing a whole series of hurdles. You might crush the Iraqi army and you might end up controlling the place. Powell said to Bush, do you realise what you're doing, Bush? You're going to be owning this place. It's not that simple. And I said to my friend, look, it's like a whole series of hurdles. Yeah, sure, you think the Americans are Superman. They'll leap over that one hurdle and then they'll continue running the race, leap over another hurdle. There's always that hurdle along the way that might catch your foot and you fall over and break your neck. My friend was convinced the Americans would be parading down the centre of Baghdad while the Iraqis were throwing flowers at them. But you Americans are so fantastic. We want to be everything you are. And Montgomery, the British general, had long before warned people like the Asians are very old cultures. They've got this crazy idea that they're not our inferiors.
Right.
They think that they're just as good as us and their traditions are just as fine. But nobody listens to Montgomery on this. Nobody.
Thank you, Stephen.
So what will be the long-term consequences?
Right.
As long as we get what we want, the Russians out of Ukraine, it's all going to fall into place beautifully. No problem. I worry about modern thought and the modern media. I worry. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's sort of there is a degree of anti-philosophical reasoning that is the norm in modern mass media that people ought to be ashamed of. I mean, they should and I don't mean that rhetorically. I mean, the ancient perspective would be that somebody would be ashamed to open their mouth and have some of the most common utterances you get in the media come out of it. And I'm not demonizing the media by saying this. Sadly, the media is, at least striving for objectivity in theory. Most of us aren't even making that much of an attempt. But this idea that you can treat goals as ends and you're done and there's a period and it's over and you don't have to think about the law of unintended consequences. The law of unintended consequences is the single most important law governing human life. That when we set things in motion, they don't stop at the convenient point that we have in mind for them, but that they keep going and ramifications and repercussions keep occurring, and that we have an obligation to study what those are. And that just because we want something doesn't mean it's good for us. This is like kindergarten level stuff to the ancients. They considered this the basics. Heraclitus said it would not be better for men if they got what they wanted. And he doesn't mean because the genie would cheat us out of what we wanted through some technicality. He literally means our wants are frequently not healthy for us. And you can see that statement of Heraclitus. It is, although often quoted in isolation as an observation, in fact, it's a conclusion of what we're talking about here with daimones. Your daimon determines what you want, and you and it have different goals. So it might make you want things that are really bad for you. And that's an obvious possibility. Even a child could reach the conclusion that there is a danger there once you introduce them to the concept that their character is its own personality with its own motivations. But because we don't have that sophisticated an understanding of human character in the modern world, we get the members of the profession most committed to objective reporting of the news, failing in almost every news program to take into account this most fundamental fact about human desire and want and goals. There is a level of missing the point that is the norm for moderns that is hard for us to conceive of because we conceive of ourselves as the best and the brightest and the most objective and the wisest and the most educated. It's hard for us to understand that as modern adults, we could be failing tests that ancient children would pass when it comes to treating our own desires with some serious degrees of caution. So next paragraph, we've got about 24 minutes left. Let's dig into the next paragraph. because it starts to move faster once we accumulate these, these pieces of the framework. Each individual owes to his daimon the quality of his ultimate judgments and assumptions. We don't like to think that's true. We like to think we can will ourselves to be accurate. But what he's saying here is our feeling for whether we have been persuasive or rigorous enough is not a rational thing. It may bring our reason to its conclusion and apply the period where we say we're done now. But ultimately, that faculty is not rational, it's subrational. It's that we feel we're done, feel we're right? And that means this falls under the powers of the daimon. This is among the unconscious things that the daimon is in charge of and not us. It says he may be led toward a fulfilling life or toward one that is stunted or frustrated, he being each of us, right? By our daimon, we could be led either way. He may advance from clarity to clarity, from keen insight to matured wisdom, or he may stumble from fiasco to fiasco, never gleaning how he himself prepared such a miscarriage of purposes. Now, I was in therapy for 24 years, and one of the hardest things for me to accept was how many of the problems in my life I had created for myself without knowing that I'd done it. The way that I laid landmines in my own path, the way that I treated life as a test. I had to keep testing myself to prove that I was good enough. And by so doing, I would make things harder and then sometimes fail the test and my life would be hard. And I'd be like, who has done this to me? Why? Life's unfair. Why did this happen to me? And the answer in these cases was, well, I was the one 6 months earlier who agreed to take this on in the first place, right? I set this crisis up for myself, but forgot about it. And then later wanted to blame somebody other than myself. Now, this isn't to say that it's the case that, everybody's only responsible for everything that happens to them. Not at all, right? It's a much more complex thing than that. But in the dialogue between ourselves and the world, we are one of those actors. So something like half of it is under our responsibility. Now, half's not enough to win. You still have to be dealt a good hand by nature, but it means that we can have a strong impact on consequences, even if we can't determine specific outcomes. And it's our character doing this to us. This is where we advance beyond sort of Victorian moralizing about saying it's your own fault if you're poor. It's like, no, it's more complicated than that, right? We're saying whatever hand you were dealt, whether you're going to be able to play it well or play it poorly has a lot to do with the luck of the draw of your daimon. It's a second factor separate from all the other factors. And what's important about that factor is that you may not be able to directly change whether you were born rich, or whether you were born a person of color in a racist society, or whether you were born a victim of genocide, or any of these things, right? Those are outside of your control. But your daimon is your divinity, and you can garden it, you can cultivate it, you can develop it and change it into something very different from what you were born with. But the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you even know that it's possible. And if you live in a cultural period like ours, which denies the existence of character, which says that we're a tabula rasa and we can make ourselves anything we want, that doesn't realistically deal with the burden of things that we inherit from our culture and our family and our genetics, combined with our ability to rewrite it if we're willing to engage in the struggle. If we're not given that insight, how are we supposed to win that race? How are we supposed to succeed at this? No one even said we could do it. This is part of why the ancients try to build art forms like tragedy that teach about the daimon and teach about human character and make it obvious to people that, those who engage with their character, those who try to study themselves, those who try to cultivate themselves can make a better hand out of what they were dealt than the people who just passively accept however the way they got started, right? You can be dealt a magnificent hand, but if you have a terrible daimon, you can make a catastrophe of your life. You can be dealt the worst hand in the world, but if you can cultivate your daimon, you could win with that hand but you need to know that it's even possible, and that it's something worth investing in. And the ancients told everybody that it was, and we tell everybody that it's not, and it doesn't even exist, and it's not a thing. So, yeah, thanks, Bob. Good talking to you. So, okay, so this is what he's talking about here when he talks about, it can go either way. Your life can go any of a number of directions. The teleology of your daimon is going to push you in directions, but everything else is jostling you, so you may or may not end up there. And you can change your daimon, which would change your teleology so that you start aiming in a different direction. There are a number of variables at work here, specific variables. Phil, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This is so complicated that to maneuver in this context. The reason I say that is, let me start off with Francis Fukuyama. In 1989, he wrote the article, "The End of History." So he was correct in some ways, right? He was sort of following Hegel, but in a ordinary way that doesn't understand Hegel. So, like, we won, it's there, period. It's over, this now is the end of history. Of course, as I suggested, there should be a semicolon because the history didn't end. It came to a kind of a halt to a certain degree, and everybody trying to figure out what's going on. So that's important. The second thing I want to bring out in relation to what you're saying, when I was still back in, I guess, Oakland, just after graduate school, as I said, I had a next door neighbor who was a very good artist, who was a very interesting guy. And we used to have a group that, well, we don't meet regularly, but we meet so often, very so often. And there was a game we play. It was, I forgot the name of it. It wasn't Liar's Poker. That's a different one that we also like play. It was one in which everybody wore a kind of hat with a ribbon on it, well, or something of that sort. And you put the cards dealt to you, you put a card in your thing. So you have no idea who you are. But on the other hand, you're able to see everybody else's cards. So you know who they are. So this is kind of a metaphor for what I'm saying about not knowing ourselves, but others know us, right? And the trick there was very interesting, because you can only play this game if you have some insight on how people are behaving in relationship to others, right? Because they could see everybody's hand, including yours, but they can't see their own. And everybody is that position. Everybody is sort of flying. I would say blind, but half blind. Like I said, it becomes a total mystery because you don't know who you are. And that was a really fun game because it becomes a kind of almost a reverse psychology, right? Because you're trying to figure out how other people are trying to figure you out. So it's, in essence, this is what happened, like in any situation. You not only have to understand yourself, you have to understand, what are these other people thinking? What is Putin thinking? What is Xi Jinping thinking? What's all these other factors in this situation thinking? Because your move, you're not the superpower that's just gonna kind of bring the heavy bulldozer and bulldoze everything away. I mean, there are players too, so it becomes a kind of complex, semi-invisible chess. So that's one factor that's kind of important. That, in a sense, the other factor is that's deep. That Francis Fukuyama probably was a bit arrogant. Is that things are so complex, and I don't even know my situation. Maybe I'm wrong. If you don't have that doubt, maybe I'm wrong, And I guess a technical way of dealing with that, which I'm not quite sure I like, but is you always have to hedge your bet. You always have to hedge, And that's one thing I don't understand about the market is because I don't know technically how to hedge, because you have to buy insurance. You can't just buy a house, because for all you know, next day your house could burn down. And where will you be at? Because you don't even own the house. Now you have to keep paying the mortgage.
Yeah.
And there's no house.
Yeah.
So you have to hedge. So you always have to take account that you're not all knowing. You could always be wrong, and you have to be very cautious in some way. Well, you can't be overly cautious, because the overly cautious person is don't do anything. Right? So which
Cautious
is
and
not
courageous
true.
at the same time, right?
So you have to do, right? That's why the semicolon is important. Do pause. Oh, let's see what's going on. And so I think this becomes, once again, it gets back to the mind trying to figure out what the hell is happening, because it doesn't really know. Yeah, and by the way, Steve, I wouldn't sing too loudly to Montgomery. I'll treat him not as an individual, but as a nation. He might be saying all these things, but on the other hand, he's got India, he's got Egypt, and this is exactly the problem. Toward the end of World War II, when Stalin was moving through Eastern Europe, he took his sweet time because he wanted to sweep up all Eastern Europe, and he had cooperation from Winston Churchill. What the dividing line would be, it was going to be divided from Turkey and Greece on down as the sphere of influence of the British, and the rest of Eastern Europe would be the sphere of influence of Russia. And when Roosevelt found that out, he was livid, because here America has tried to help this to defeat the power, but they were always playing the next game. And of course, the British want to protect their colonies. So it wasn't that they were goody, good, whatever. They will actually protect their own self-interest. And it wasn't until the Suez Canal happened, I think in 1956 or whatever, later on, that America says, you gotta give up the Suez Canal,
Mhm.
and we play the power hand, is that, and essentially that's what happened. That was sort of the beginning of the decolonialization, right? Because, like, of course, France wanted to keep of course, they were defeated, Bien Men Phu, want to keep their colonies. Why not? We own this, So in some sense, there's always these players, and all of us are that way to a certain degree, that are not playing totally fair, And when you're playing in a world that's not totally fair, you have to be also even more cautious, because, who knows? You could be the next person that's dominated. That's all I want to say at this moment.
Thank you, Phil.
Don't sing him so quickly.
Well, I'm going to take us from Montgomery back to the text, and then I'll call on Stephen in a moment. So we're talking about the relationship of the daimon to the individual, and how it is basically this is an indirect model of human character, in which the character has autonomy separate from the will of the person. What we want for ourselves is separate from what our character is setting us up to have, or what we think we want for ourselves is separate from what our character is setting us up to want or to notice. You can some of the implications you can see here. It's possible to know about something in the world and want it consciously, and yet to have a character that makes that invisible to us, so we don't notice it. So over and over, we miss the opportunity to have the thing that we consciously want to have. This is an example of an implication, a possibility of this model of character that we're talking about here. So you can get some complex behavior right? A lot of what Freud and Sachs talk about is basically foreshadowed by this model in a way that the more modern models of human character can't account for. So daimones, like all else in life, may be benign or malignant. They may enhance and empower or shrivel and cripple our inner powers for self-conduct. Since all humans are effects, this sentence. Since all humans are effects generated within the natural order, which right off the bat, you could have a book just about that opening, but he just blows past it with a since. All are indebted to forces and conditions outside their own influence for what they have been shaped to be. That is, we did not make ourselves, and we are not fully under our own control. We are not, the will within us, our noesis, likes to imagine us as 100% conscious and willful and voluntary. But this model of human character forces us to accept an enormous freight and momentum associated with the unconscious, with things that we have to suffer as a pathos, whether we like it or not. We inherit things that we never agreed to inherit, if you will. Whether they're problems in the world outside or problems in our own character, we never signed up for that, but here we are anyway, and this is the hand we have that we have to somehow make something of. This ancient model of human character sets us up well to understand these kinds of problems, as well as to understand problems of people who seemingly inherit everything just the way you would think they would need, the wealth and privilege and good looks and blah, 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 and yet still they make a catastrophe of their life. And more modern conceptions of character can't explain why that happens, other than, shit happens, right? This is our summation anytime our models don't work. But the ancients are like, oh, no, it's far more interesting than that. This person's character was seriously out of sync with their circumstances, and it changed their circumstances to match their character. It's in a non-deterministic, the end is not guaranteed kind of way, just in a nudging, in a relentless nudging and pushing. Stephen, go ahead. You got your hand up.
The word colonizer and colonization, as it's being gleefully thrown around today. The fact is a fact. Not just all humans, every form of life colonizes. The most primitive forms of life will attach themselves to a ship's bottom and find themselves a new harbour to take over. Not just humans, not just one particular set of humans like the British. Every human, every animal, every form of life will colonise. Now, if the British weren't around, it would be somebody else doing all the colonisation. Maybe there's a bit of a pecking order there, I don't know. But if you knock off the top dog, there's plenty of dogs down the line who'll become the top dog. This is what Orwell warned us about. He said in the case of where the oppressed fight against the oppressor, unfortunately, a small group of the former oppressed, once gaining power, will become the new oppressors again and again and again. So beware of wagging this finger on colonisation when the Marxists, and I know the Marxists very well because I spent a huge chunk of my life being one, I realised they had the worst colonisation program going. The Marxists literally want to completely colonise every aspect of the human being and every aspect of life with their politics. And I would say politics just simply belongs to a spectrum of what we are. We have our own individual sense of being. The Marxists want that, they want to colonise that. We have our own bodies. The Marxists want to colonise that. So this finger waving about colonisation, dispute me on the question or on my statement. that every form of life will colonize when it gets the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. There's a discussion we could have sometime about the problem of the use of the word colonization to refer to the issue that people are trying to talk about. It leads to conflation, right? What you're talking about is what all organisms do, and what the critique is with regard to privilege and marginalization is about a different phenomena, but because it's using the same word, it makes it hard to talk about. This is a recurring theme in Kenneth Smith and in these seminars as well, that we're constantly tripping over our own language for not making the distinctions we need to make, and for it separates things that should be together and it puts together things that should be separated until pretty soon it's not clear what the hell we're talking about. But within the constraints of the English language and the use of the word colony and colonization, you're right on. You're right on, of course. But let's, in our remaining 2.5 minutes, I'm going to throw out the second half of this second paragraph from Kenneth Smith, from section E. With regard to our ultimate resources for cultivating our insights and abilities, we must be passive recipients of obscure endowments. Let me hit that again. With regard to our ultimate resources, what is our capacity to cultivate our character? To what extent can we cultivate our character? He's saying that too is a feature of character, right? Some people have characters that do not allow them to cultivate themselves effectively. Other people have characters that might allow them to cultivate themselves if they cultivate that part of themselves in order to increase their ability to cultivate themselves. When you start getting feedback loops like this, you get some very complicated relationships going on. But he's basically saying that the awareness, the ability to be aware of your own character, the ability to treat your character as something you could cultivate, and the desire to do so are all features of your character. So that implies some people could be dealt a hand so bad that they can't make it better. There's nothing in their character that prepares them to do it. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessitated by genetics, and neither is Kenneth. He's saying there's something complex going on here about the relationship between genetics, experience, culture, and so on. And we haven't even begun to catalog what all the impacts are. What are all the things that go into adding up to it? But what they add up to is the character. And you can only work within the frame that the character is giving you. And that includes the ability to modify the frame. You follow me so far? He's saying there's whether you can cultivate your character is an aspect of character, is what he's saying in this opening here. We must be passive recipients of obscure endowments. We don't know where our character came from. We aren't even aware, most of us, we have a character, let alone what it's like. And therefore, our initial reaction to it, our initial relationship to it is pathos. We suffer it the way you suffer gravity or anything else. For many people, they are synonymous with their character because they lack the ability to perceive it or modify it. And therefore, they are nothing more than symptoms of their character. People who can cultivate their character can become something more than a symptom of their character, because they can become self-modifying. And who knows, what happens then. But people who've never been taught that their character even exists, who've never been shown it, who've never been shown the capacity to change it, and who don't want to change it, even if they did know it was there, they have a different existential life ahead of them than someone who might be able to change their character. No one architects or originates his own resources of insight, but at best we can cultivate judiciously what we have. And this goes to that previous chapter about arete and excellence, right? We are all different from each other. We are all born different. We have different things that we can be good at. And if you think about it, he's saying a couple of things here. One of them is more obvious than the other. And I'm going to go a little over, but I think it's worth getting us through this. The more obvious thing he's saying is that whether or not you can cultivate your own character is one of those differences between people, like whether someone has perfect pitch or an amazing nose for aromas and scents, or just loves like heck to run and has the bones and joints to run like the wind. There's so many different varieties of people and things that we could be good at. And he's saying that among those things, we have to include whether or not you can perceive or care about changing your own character, whether you can learn to perceive. Nobody does automatically, but whether you have the capacity to turn around and look at yourself. And that's because your character is determining what's foreground and background. And if your character won't let your own character be foreground ever, well, then it's essentially invisible. You don't know it's there. And if somebody tries to tell you, you don't believe them. They might as well be telling you about the unicorn in the corner that you can't see. So this is one of the things, and this is extremely uncomfortable, right? He's saying that our level of diversity and difference between us is so great, it even applies to whether people can improve their character or not. Some people are just going to be symptoms of their character, and that's just how it's going to be. This is the ancient perspective. But there's even more subtlety to this. I guess I'll save that for next week. There's even more subtlety to this, to the relationship between what you inherit, your diversity. Oh, no, I'll go ahead and say it this week. So suppose that you're born with perfect pitch. You could be an incredible musician, but you're born with a character that takes no interest in music, right? That's something that's not going to happen to a songbird. A cheetah isn't going to be born with the capacity to be an incredible runner and no desire to do so. That's a tragedy that can only happen to a person, because our character and our other gifts are not coordinated the way that in other animals their arites are coordinated with their instincts. You see what I'm saying? This is a uniquely human problem. And again, it's not to say that you can't come up with border cases. In any species, you can always find a border case. But where's the bell curve that helps define what a species is? For most species, the bell curve is, if you have a possibility of some arete, you are probably born with the instincts that make you see that thing and love doing that thing and want to practice it and get better at it. The cheetah wants to run. The peregrine falcon wants to fly and dive. They want to do these things. They're born wanting to do it. But people's arites and their characters are dealt out of two separate decks, unrelated to each other. And the many diverse things that we could do, many of them we aren't interested in. We don't even perceive them. We might not even like them. To have both the gift and the character that wants to cultivate that gift requires 2 bits of luck, not 1. This is built into this model. So you can see why the ancients, they're not pessimists per se, but to a modern, they seem like pessimists, right? They keep describing a situation that has complexities in it that sound unfair, because you don't want a story to go that way. I imagine that there have been novels written about characters who clearly had the capacity to do something but no interest and never did. And I don't know whether that's a comedy or a farce or a tragedy or what, but I can tell you that's not the norm of what you see on television or read in a contemporary novel today. Well, moderns don't really like this idea. We're not interested. We don't really perceive this idea. It's part of the background that our character in our epoch kind of pushes away and says, nah. But to the ancients, this kind of tragedy was very interesting. And they thought that everybody should be alert to it. They wanted to foreground it in their stories and make sure that everybody thought about this problem of, you have to discover your gifts and you have to try to, if you can, cultivate your character. And the culture should try to help you cultivate you to be able to make the most of your gifts. Because if it turns out those are the gifts our culture needs that only you have, or we don't survive, but your character is such that you don't care and you're not interested in those gifts and you don't do anything with them, then we're doomed, right? This is the ancient perspective. We need to somehow help people develop the things that they could be great at, if we can, to the extent that we have, any ability to help them discover those things and develop those things. Very different from No Child Left Behind. Go ahead, Donald.
question for next week. What kind of character drives a philosopher to make explicit such a scheme? But, you know, what if nature hadn't provided the raw materials for this sort of thing to be made explicit? You know, it's sort of a self-referential thing, almost Hegelian. You know, if the world spirit hadn't have allowed, you know, hadn't have yielded Hegel, we wouldn't have known about the world spirit. So what drove Kenneth to write such stuff?
Right.
What's in his character that he feels he has to do all this?
Yes. You know, I think part of what Kenneth would say a number of things in answer to it. First, he'd laugh, but he'd say a number of things in answer to it. And one of the things he'd say is, he'd quote Hegel and say, you know, the owl of Minerva only takes flight with the fall of night. He'd say, it's because late stage modernity is so irritating, because its praise for itself is so magnificent and expansive, and then it fails to deliver on that, that it drives people to ask, what is wrong here? How can this be happening over and over? And sooner or later, that means somebody is going to be asking that question who's got the materials required to dig into it.
Well, late stage is only a hope.
Well,
It's not a fact yet.
you know, my background is ecological, so you know, I look I look at counts of species diversity and climate and things like that, and I'm like, you know, there are a lot of tricks that can be played technologically, but you know, if you poison all your fresh water, sooner or later you don't have any, and then you can't support a very large population. That's just how that goes.
Oh, we're not going on to another stage then. That's planetary death.
I don't know, you know, it's
or just species death for us.
It's certainly inconceivable how the modern marketplace can work if there isn't an abundance of resources to be squandered. But other epochs have, you know, related to nature in different ways. So
I was thinking of Forbidden Planet, where they discover a world where the aliens had progressed to something far beyond humans, far beyond present humans in nobleness of mind. And yet, when they finally evolve a fantastic technology, that darker aspect in their nature is still there. And it destroys them.
I love that. I love that movie.
I'm thinking of a British movie called Chariots of Fire that addressed this issue in its own way. Not perfectly, but it does. That's a running movie. It's about runners.
Yes.
Chariots of Fire.
I should watch that again. But yeah, let me drop in a link to Forbidden Planet here. And a link to Chariots of Fire just to remind us. Yeah, because when I watched Chariots of Fire, I was a kid, and I did not have the philosophical sophistication to understand what that movie was about. I thought it was a movie about people running. You know what I mean? That there was something deeper going on entirely eluded me. So I will have to watch it again. But let's wrap up here.
Right.
And
I've still got the two questions on the boiler.
I have not forgotten.
Lateral, rather than just what Kierkegaard said about Gleitner, which is typically so philosophically refined and might be true. My point is far more lateral about Gleitner, so that's still on the boil. And what is rationality? We have the ancient Greeks. They rationalize nature and perception. Socrates took it another step and started rationalizing the mind. So that's the big question. What is rationality? Where it's on everybody's lips to be rational. And when you ask them, well, what is rationality?
this enormous desideratum that they can't stop talking about, they suddenly shut up about.
Hey, Stephen, your issue has been tabled, and it's a very long table. That's what it seems like.
I pick it up every week. Yeah. All right. Have a great week, everybody.
Right.
And we'll,
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks again. Bye-bye. Everybody,
Bye.
including Steve.
Thank you. Thank